Imagine you are controlling a space telescope, aiming it directly at a spacecraft that has just plunged toward the edge of a black hole. In every science fiction film, you would watch that spacecraft cross a dark boundary and vanish into the void. But the universe does not operate to the rhythm of cinema. If you were actually standing at a safe distance and looking through that lens right now, you would never see the spacecraft fall inside. You could sit there and watch for an entire lifetime. You could pass that telescope down to the next generation so they could continue staring into that empty space for another 10,000 years. The spacecraft would simply hover there, its image slowly shifting to a deep crimson, slowing down and freezing perfectly in the absolute dark. You might think this is an optical flaw of the lens. You might assume the spacecraft has actually crossed and that the light is merely deceiving you. It is not. I have just described a boundary where quantum mechanics and the fabric of space and time refuse to compromise. A place where a physical object can be permanently frozen in time from the perspective of one observer, while simultaneously falling freely toward its end from the perspective of another. Welcome to the event horizon. We rely on terrestrial intuition to understand the cosmos. Our daily biological experience dictates that when an object moves far enough away, it eventually crosses a physical horizon and disappears from view. Cinema actively amplifies this expectation. We are shown violent gravitational whirlpools, where matter is aggressively stretched and consumed in a brilliant, chaotic flash of light, but general relativity does not cater to our visual expectations. The theatrical portrayal fundamentally misunderstands what a black hole actually is. It is not a physical object acting as a cosmic predator. It is a severe geometric curvature of space and time. When the spacecraft approaches this curvature, it is not entering a physical mouth. It is entering a localized temporal deficit. Because we observe the universe through the strict medium of light, our visual reality is entirely dependent on photons successfully traveling across the interstellar void to reach our eyes. Cinema assumes this light travels uniformly, completely ignoring the catastrophic physical toll that extreme gravity exacts on a photon attempting to climb away from the horizon. The universe does not provide a visual climax because the visual data itself is mathematically exhausted. The absolute silence of the crossing is not a directorial choice. It is a rigid physical law. But if the architecture of space-time strictly forbids us from observing the disappearance, we are forced to confront a severe mechanical discrepancy. The foundational laws of physics dictate a strict accounting of reality. Physical matter cannot simply cease to exist. When we observe the event horizon and see the frozen image of the spacecraft, we are not looking at the physical machine. We are looking at an optical echo. We are observing the final, exhausted photons struggling to climb out of an extreme gravitational well. The image is merely a ghost, but the spacecraft itself possesses physical mass. It is constructed of titanium, copper, and carbon. The billions of atoms comprising its hull do not actually hover at the edge of the abyss. The physical mass strictly obeys the local geometry of space and time, and it continues its inexorable downward trajectory. This phenomenon creates a profound divorce between visual data and physical reality. The mass of the machine physically crosses the threshold, effectively leaving its own optical signature behind. The precise moment that mass slips past the geometric boundary, it permanently severs its causal link with the outside universe. Today, we accept this absolute boundary as a standard architectural feature of the cosmos. But humanity did not discover this invisible sphere by pointing a telescope into the dark. We could not, because the optical mechanics of the universe actively hide it. We discovered it instead on a piece of paper, hidden deep within a complex mathematical equation, solved by a dying artillery officer in the freezing trenches of the First World War. In the winter of 1915, the European continent was tearing itself apart. On the frozen mud of the Russian front during the First World War, an artillery lieutenant in the German army, was meticulously calculating the parabolic trajectories of explosive shells. His name was Karl Schwarzschild. Before the war, he was the esteemed director of the Astrophysical Observatory at Potsdam. Now he was a soldier suffering from a rare, painfully debilitating, and ultimately fatal autoimmune disease. Between the deafening barrages of artillery fire, Schwarzschild was reading a scientific paper that had been published in Berlin just weeks earlier. It contained Albert Einstein's brand new theory of general relativity. Einstein had presented the world with a set of 10 immensely complex field equations. They were designed to describe exactly how the presence of mass and energy warps the fundamental fabric of space and time. The mathematics were so notoriously non-linear and difficult that Einstein himself relied entirely on approximate solutions. He publicly doubted that anyone would be able to find an exact mathematical solution to his equations anytime soon. Schwarzschild accomplished it in a matter of weeks. Sitting in the freezing trenches, physically deteriorating from his illness, Schwarzschild sought refuge in the pure, absolute logic of mathematics. To simplify the staggering complexity of Einstein's equations, he made a strict theoretical assumption. He decided to calculate the geometry of empty space surrounding a single, perfectly spherical, non-rotating mass. By stripping away the chaotic variables of a real universe, Schwarzschild successfully derived the very first exact solution to the equations of general relativity. He had mathematically mapped the precise curvature of spacetime generated by a perfectly round star. He packaged his calculations and mailed them back to Berlin. Included with the manuscript was a letter to Einstein, written with profound humility. Schwarzschild wrote that the war had treated him kindly enough, in spite of the heavy gunfire, to allow him to take a quiet walk through the landscape of Einstein's ideas. Einstein was astonished by the elegance of the solution and immediately presented the paper to the Prussian Academy of Sciences. But this moment of intellectual triumph carried a hidden physical cost. Buried deep within the flawless mathematics of Schwarzschild's solution was a geometric anomaly. It was a mathematical absolute that seemed to completely violate the laws of nature, producing a localized consequence so extreme that Einstein himself would spend years aggressively trying to prove it could not physically exist. To grasp the precise anomaly hiding within Schwarzschild's calculations, we must first examine a fundamental mechanic of orbital physics known as escape velocity. Imagine standing in a field and throwing a stone straight up into the sky. The gravitational pull of the Earth eventually slows its ascent and pulls it back down. If you throw the stone harder, it travels higher before succumbing to the curve of gravity. If you were to build a machine capable of launching that stone at a velocity of roughly 7 miles per second, it would possess enough kinetic energy to completely outrun the gravitational pull of the planet. It would never return. That critical threshold of 7 miles per second is the Earth's escape velocity. It is dictated by a strict ratio between the total mass of the planet and the physical distance from its center. If you were to take the Earth and aggressively compress it down to a fraction of its current size, while keeping its total mass exactly the same, the surface of the planet would be drawn much closer to the center of gravity. Consequently, the gravitational intensity at the new surface would skyrocket, and the required escape velocity would drastically increase. Karl Schwarzschild applied this exact mechanical logic to the dying core of a massive star. His solution to Einstein's equations asked a purely theoretical question. What happens to the geometry of space if you compress a star so severely that its surface gravity continues to compound toward infinity? The mathematics returned a precise and stunning boundary. As the theoretical star is crushed, its escape velocity rises exponentially. Eventually, the mass is compressed into a sphere so remarkably dense that the escape velocity at its surface reaches exactly 186,000 miles per second. That is the absolute speed of light in a vacuum. Because the laws of physics strictly forbid any object, particle, or wave of information from traveling faster than a photon, the consequence is absolute. The moment a dying star collapses past this specific geometric threshold, now forever known as the Schwarzschild radius, the required escape velocity exceeds the universal speed limit. Nothing can ever leave. The math revealed two distinct geometric structures born from this collapse. The first is the event horizon, a perfect spherical membrane marking the exact boundary where light speed is no longer fast enough to escape. The second structure lies at the dead center of the sphere. The equations dictated that once matter crosses the horizon, no physical force in the cosmos can halt its inward trajectory. The star is crushed down to a point of infinite density and absolutely zero physical volume. This is the mathematical singularity. The equations were mathematically flawless, but they described a physical structure where the very concept of outward motion ceases to exist, creating a localized region that effectively isolates itself from the remainder of the cosmos. Karl Schwarzschild never lived to witness the intellectual chaos his equations unleashed. In May of 1916, mere months after mailing his manuscript to Berlin, he succumbed to his illness on the Russian front. He left behind a mathematical blueprint that the global scientific community simply refused to accept. For decades, the sharpest minds in physics treated the Schwarzschild radius not as a physical reality, but as a mathematical artifact. They viewed it as a bizarre quirk of the equations. They eagerly used his calculations to map the weak gravitational fields far away from normal stars and planets, but they fiercely rejected the idea of the singularity at the core. To understand this visceral rejection, we must understand how a theoretical physicist views the concept of infinity. In pure mathematics, infinity is a standard concept, but in applied physics, infinity is not a number, it is an alarm bell. When an equation produces a result of infinite density or zero physical volume, it is the mathematics explicitly stating that the theory has catastrophically broken down. It implies a localized point where the foundational laws of nature simply cease to function. The scientific community abhorred this idea. They believed the universe to be rational, smooth, and strictly predictable. Albert Einstein himself led the resistance against the anomaly his own theory had inadvertently created. In 1939, Einstein published a paper in the Annals of Mathematics, attempting to definitively prove that nature would always intervene to prevent total gravitational collapse. He structured his argument around the conservation of angular momentum. Einstein theorized that as a massive star contracted, the particles within its core would naturally spin faster and faster, much like an ice skater pulling their arms inward to increase their rotation. He calculated that before the dying star could ever reach the critical Schwarzschild radius, the outward centrifugal force generated by this extreme spin would become so violent that it would tear the matter apart. Nature, Einstein concluded, possessed an inherent defense mechanism against the singularity. Other prominent astrophysicists of the era shared this deep denial. They mockingly referred to these theoretical objects as frozen stars. They argued that because extreme gravity slows down the flow of time, the physical collapse of a star would appear to take an infinite amount of time from the perspective of an outside observer. Therefore, they reasoned, the event horizon could never actually form within the finite lifespan of the universe. They were entirely comfortable using the equations on a chalkboard, but they drew a hard line at accepting a cosmic trapdoor. The idea that a localized region of space could weave a one-way boundary, a membrane that permanently severs causal contact with the rest of reality, felt like scientific heresy. But the universe does not consult human intuition. It does not care about our philosophical discomfort. The mathematics were not an error, they were a prophecy. The boundary was absolutely real. Yet to comprehend how this phantom membrane actually functions without acting as a physical brick wall, we must completely abandon our concept of spatial dimensions and stare directly into the mechanical gears of time. To decode the illusion of the event horizon, we must first unlearn a fundamental terrestrial instinct. For centuries, classical physics conditioned us to view gravity as an active mechanical tether. We drop a stone and we assume the planet is actively reaching up to pull it downward. We feel our own weight pressing into the floor, and we conclude that an invisible force is aggressively dragging us toward the core. Modern astrophysics demands that we completely abandon this narrative. Gravity does not pull, it does not exert any mechanical force whatsoever. To understand the true nature of falling, we must observe motion not through space, but through time. Imagine an object resting in the absolute vacuum of deep intergalactic space, millions of light years away from the nearest galaxy. From a spatial perspective, it is perfectly motionless, but it is not truly standing still. It is continuously moving forward through the dimension of time. Every single atom in that object is advancing from 1 second to the next, traveling through the time direction at the absolute maximum rate permitted by the universe. Now we introduce a massive celestial body into that empty void. The sheer mass of this body mathematically distorts the surrounding environment. It does not simply warp physical space, it fundamentally alters the flow of time. It creates a temporal gradient. The closer you move toward the center of the mass, the slower time flows. When our motionless object is placed into this gradient, it encounters a severe geometric problem. The portion of the object closest to the mass is submerged in slightly slower time, while the portion further away remains in slightly faster time. Because the object is a cohesive physical structure held together by atomic bonds, it cannot simultaneously exist at two different temporal speeds. The discrepancy across its length forces its overall direction of travel to pivot. Think of a vehicle driving on a paved road where the left wheels suddenly drift into thick mud. The left wheels drag and slow down, the right wheels maintain their fast speed, and the entire vehicle violently rotates toward the slower side. Space-time executes this exact same mechanical pivot. The object's trajectory through time rotates slightly, pointing downward toward the region of slower time. That geometric rotation converts temporal motion into spatial motion. The object begins to drift toward the mass. This is the exact physical definition of falling. No invisible hand is pulling the object. It is merely maintaining its natural forward motion through a region where reality itself is sloped. Near a standard rocky planet, this temporal slope is incredibly gentle. But as we turn our focus back toward the collapsed core of a dead star, we are no longer dealing with a gentle curve. We are about to trace this temporal slope down to a depth where the gradient of time transforms into a vertical wall, creating a geometric trap that visually paralyzes anything attempting to cross it. Consider a highly precise atomic clock attached to a long tether, slowly lowered into the gravitational well of a collapsed stellar core. Far out in the empty void, the temporal slope is shallow. The lowered clock ticks in near-perfect synchronization with a reference clock held safely on our distant observation ship. As the tether drops deeper, the geometry of space-time severely compresses. The immense mass of the collapsed core is actively dragging the dimension of time downward. At a distance of 10,000 miles, a clear geometric discrepancy emerges. For every 10 ticks recorded on our local clock, the lowered clock completes only 9. The mechanical components of the instrument are not failing. The physical duration of a single second within that localized region is actively stretching. To understand the absolute extreme of this gradient, we must consult the rigid ledger of relativity. Every object in the cosmos possesses a strictly fixed allocation of motion through space-time. As the gravitational curvature becomes more aggressive, the act of simply holding a stationary position against the slope requires a massive expenditure of that temporal budget. The clock is physically forced to trade its progression through time to pay for its resistance in space. We now allow the tether to drop precisely to the mathematical threshold. We lower it to the exact surface of the Schwarzschild radius. Here, the mathematics of general relativity dictate a geometric absolute. The temporal gradient ceases to be a measurable slope. It becomes a vertical plunge. At the exact boundary of the event horizon, the required escape velocity perfectly matches the speed of light. Consequently, the spatial curvature demands 100% of the object's relativistic budget just to maintain a fixed position. Because the entire budget is violently consumed by spatial resistance, absolutely nothing remains for temporal progression. At the event horizon, the rate of time relative to the distant universe falls to exactly zero. It does not merely slow down, it stops identically. This absolute cessation of time is the mechanical engine driving the illusion of the frozen spacecraft. It explains why a falling probe appears to hover endlessly in the dark from the perspective of an outside observer. The visual representation of the machine is locked into a coordinate where the flow of reality has ceased to function. However, this geometric absolute instantly triggers a catastrophic optical contradiction. If the flow of time at the boundary has fallen to exactly zero, the atoms comprising the spacecraft are perfectly motionless, yet an object that is perfectly frozen in zero time is mechanically prohibited from emitting the active photons required to transmit its image across the void. To resolve the optical contradiction of the frozen spacecraft, we must examine the physical behavior of light itself as it attempts to cross this extreme geometric landscape. If the flow of time at the event horizon has fallen to exactly zero, one might intuitively assume that light simply stops moving. But a photon is a massless particle bound by a strict physical mandate. It must always travel at the absolute maximum speed permitted by causality within its local frame. It cannot decrease its velocity and it cannot coast to a halt. Instead of losing speed, the photon loses energy. Imagine a single pulse of light emitted by the communication array of the falling probe, directed outward toward our distant telescope. As this photon begins its journey away from the collapsed core, it is forced to climb the steepest temporal gradient in the cosmos. It is effectively swimming upstream against the vertical distortion of spacetime. Because the photon cannot reduce its speed to pay the immense gravitational toll, the universe exacts the payment from its frequency. In the mechanics of wave physics, a photon's energy is directly proportional to its frequency. As the light struggles to climb out of the deep gravitational well, its underlying geometry is physically stretched by the curvature of space-time. A tight, highly energetic wave of blue light is stretched into a longer, less energetic wave of red light. Astrophysicists define this exact mechanical exhaustion as gravitational redshift. As the spacecraft descends closer to the absolute boundary, the temporal slope becomes infinitely steep. The photons emitted by its metallic hull are required to expend a catastrophic amount of energy simply to climb away from the mass. Through the lens of our observation deck, we witness this geometric exhaustion playing out in a strict sequence. The brilliant white reflection of the spacecraft shifts into a deep, dark crimson. As the probe sinks further into the gradient, the wavelengths stretch beyond the biological capacity of the human eye. The visual data shifts completely into the infrared spectrum, then degrades into microwaves, and finally elongates into vast, faint radio waves. The image dims until it reaches a state of absolute optical standstill. The final photons are stretched to a wavelength approaching infinity. We never observed the spacecraft crossing the threshold because the light emitted at the precise geometric moment of crossing would require an infinite amount of energy to escape the horizon and reach our eyes. The visual information of the probe is smeared across the outer boundary, fading seamlessly into absolute darkness. The universe perfectly preserves the timeline of the outside observer by slowly erasing the optical signature of the falling mass. We now possess a complete mechanical explanation for the optical illusion. The external universe sees a static, faded ghost of a machine that never seemingly finishes its journey. But a profound fracture in reality emerges when we fundamentally change our frame of reference. The optical standstill is merely an artifact of distance and temporal geometry. What physical reality unfolds if we abandon the telescope and instead observe the descent through the camera lens mounted directly to the hull of the falling spacecraft? To understand the profound physical contradiction of the black hole, we must completely abandon the telescope. We must seal ourselves inside the titanium hull of the falling spacecraft and observe the descent strictly from the passenger's perspective. The mechanical foundation of this viewpoint was established in the year 1907. Albert Einstein was working as a clerk in a patent office in Bern, Switzerland, when he experienced a sudden conceptual revelation. He would later describe it as the happiest thought of his entire life. He visualized a man falling freely from the roof of a building. Einstein realized a profound physical truth about that rapid descent. While the man is falling, he does not feel his own weight. If the falling man were to release an apple from his hand, the apple would fall at the exact same geometric rate, appearing to hover motionless right beside him. From the localized perspective of the falling man, the force of gravity ceases to exist. This revelation birthed the equivalence principle. The principle mathematically dictates that the local effects of freefall are absolutely indistinguishable from drifting in the empty zero gravity of deep space. When we apply this rigid law to our spacecraft, plunging toward the collapsed stellar core, our terrestrial intuition shatters. We are biologically conditioned to associate falling with a violent physical sensation. But in the vacuum of space, free fall is not an acceleration. It is the geometric equivalent of resting. A falling object is merely following the straightest possible path through a region where the flow of time is sloped. Because there is no atmospheric friction to drag against the hull and no solid floor to aggressively push upward, the spacecraft experiences absolutely zero mechanical force. An accelerometer mounted to the dashboard reads exactly 0. The astronaut floating inside the cabin feels completely weightless and entirely unbothered by the sheer astronomical mass pulling them downward. The crushing gravitational curvature that mathematically paralyzed their visual signature for the outside observer simply does not register inside the local frame of the ship. Their local reality is impeccably peaceful, their biological heartbeats remain steady, and the mechanical clocks on the dashboard tick at a perfectly standard rate of 1 second per second. Yet this tranquil local physics serves as an absolute geometric trap, perfectly masking the fact that they are milliseconds away from intersecting a cosmic membrane that possesses absolutely no physical substance but strictly outlaws any return to the universe above. As the spacecraft approaches the absolute mathematical boundary, the universe offers no physical warning. There is no solid surface to strike, no sudden atmospheric friction against the hull, and no violent turbulence to signal the end of a cosmic journey. The event horizon is not a physical wall constructed of compressed matter or exotic radiation. It is entirely composed of empty space. From the localized perspective of the falling astronaut, the precise moment of crossing the Schwarzschild radius is flawlessly uneventful. The dashboard clocks continue their steady mechanical rhythm. The cabin remains completely tranquil. If the astronaut were to look out the rear viewport toward the distant galaxies, the light from the outside universe would still pour into the cabin. It would be heavily distorted into a bright halo by the extreme geometric curvature of space, but it would remain perfectly visible. The spacecraft slips through the phantom membrane without a single shudder. This silent crossing exposes the ultimate mechanical deception of general relativity. The absolute boundary that freezes time and permanently traps light from the perspective of the distant telescope simply does not register as a physical barrier for the passenger. The universe seamlessly accommodates two wildly conflicting realities. The outside observer is mathematically locked into viewing a permanent optical standstill, While the falling astronaut experiences a smooth, uninterrupted freefall directly into the dark, they are now officially inside the black hole. Their causal link to the outside universe is permanently severed. No signal can ever return, but biologically and mechanically, they are completely unharmed. This serene survival, however, is entirely dependent on one specific architectural detail: the sheer physical scale of the collapsed mass. Cinematic logic often dictates that a larger gravitational structure must naturally be more dangerous and destructive. The rigid mechanics of space-time gradients dictate the exact opposite. If our spacecraft had plummeted toward a standard stellar mass black hole, a compact sphere spanning only a few miles across, the astronaut and the titanium hull would have been subjected to a catastrophic mechanical failure long before ever reaching the horizon. Yet, they survive here because we deliberately aimed their trajectory toward a supermassive variant, an astronomical structure containing millions of solar masses. Why does a vastly heavier and larger gravitational structure offer a perfectly peaceful crossing, while a much smaller one guarantees immediate physical destruction? The answer requires us to measure a microscopic discrepancy in the slope of time across the length of the human body. Gravity is not a uniform blanket, it is a strictly localized geometric slope. When a physical object descends toward a gravitational center, the portion of the object closest to the core always experiences a slightly steeper temporal gradient than the portion further away. On a standard rocky planet, this mathematical difference is so microscopic it remains completely undetectable by human biology. But within the extreme geometry of a collapsed stellar core, this minute discrepancy transforms into a severe mechanical shear. Consider the physical architecture of a standard stellar mass black hole. If a dying star is crushed into a sphere measuring merely 10 miles across, the event horizon is wrapped incredibly tight around the central mass. Consequently, the temporal slope steepens with extreme violence over a remarkably short spatial distance. If an astronaut approaches this compact boundary feet first, the gravitational curvature acting upon their boots is radically more severe than the curvature acting upon their helmet. The mathematics of relativity demand that the feet accelerate downward significantly faster than the head. This creates an immense internal tension known as a tidal force, long before the astronaut or the spacecraft ever touches the actual event horizon. The biological structure and the titanium hull are subjected to a profound physical conflict. The object is forcefully stretched along the vertical axis and simultaneously compressed along the horizontal axis. Astrophysicists refer to this exact mechanical dismantling as spaghettification. The spacecraft would be drawn out into a superheated stream of subatomic particles, disassembled entirely by the sharp gradient of the slope. This is exactly why our theoretical journey required a supermassive variant. A supermassive black hole contains the equivalent mass of billions of suns. This immense accumulation of matter pushes the event horizon outward, creating a spherical boundary spanning millions of miles in diameter. Because this absolute boundary is located so incredibly far from the central mass, the localized gravitational slope precisely at the horizon is dramatically flattened. When our spacecraft crosses this massive threshold, the geometric discrepancy between the nose and the tail of the ship is effectively zero. The temporal gradient is intensely deep relative to the outside universe, but strictly within the local frame of the falling ship, it is perfectly smooth. The tidal forces are completely negligible. The passenger glides across the absolute boundary completely intact, effortlessly surviving a membrane that permanently isolates them from the rest of the cosmos. But this serene passage merely delivers them into an architectural nightmare. Now that the phantom threshold has been crossed, the fundamental fabric of reality executes a complete geometric inversion. The passenger is about to discover that the singularity waiting at the center of the dark is no longer a physical location. Inside the event horizon, the standard architecture of reality simply collapses. In the familiar universe outside the dark boundary, a human pilot operates within 3 physical dimensions. They can maneuver a spacecraft left or right, pitch the nose up or down, and accelerate forward or reverse backward. Time serves as the rigid 4th dimension. It flows strictly in one unidirectional current, carrying the passenger steadily from the past into the unwritten future. A pilot possesses absolute freedom of movement through physical space, but they maintain absolutely zero control over their forward trajectory through time. The precise mathematical moment the spacecraft slips past the Schwarzschild radius, these fundamental roles violently invert. When Carl Schwarzschild originally mapped the metric of spacetime inside the boundary, the mathematics revealed a profound geometric shock. In the core equations of general relativity, the spatial dimension pointing radially toward the center of the black hole mathematically swaps its sign with the dimension of time. Space and time literally exchange their foundational physical properties. The radial distance leading toward the central core completely ceases to be a physical measurement of space. It transforms seamlessly into a strict measure of time. The immediate physical consequence of this inversion is absolute. Attempting to turn the spacecraft around and fire the main engines to fly back across the boundary becomes structurally impossible. It is no longer a matter of lacking sufficient thrust or kinetic energy. In this completely inverted geometry, the event horizon you just crossed is no longer located physically behind the ship. It is now located strictly in your past. Firing the thrusters to escape would be as geometrically absurd as building a rocket on Earth and firing its engines in a desperate attempt to travel back to last Tuesday. The outward spatial direction has been permanently erased from the local universe. Every single possible physical trajectory inside the horizon now points relentlessly inward. If the pilot panics and fires the lateral engines in any random direction, they will not delay their descent. Because the axes of space and time are fundamentally warped, injecting kinetic energy into the ship only forces it to travel faster along the new temporal axis. In a black hole, struggling physically only makes the end arrive much faster. All physical roads inside the membrane now lead to the exact same destination. But if the center of this massive gravitational collapse is no longer a fixed coordinate in physical space, we must completely redefine the mysterious anomaly waiting in the dark. The singularity is the most severely misrepresented structure in modern astrophysics. Cinematic portrayals routinely depict it as a physical destination. We naturally imagine a microscopic, infinitely dense sphere resting at the exact center of a vast, dark room. We assume that if a pilot were skilled enough, they could simply steer their spacecraft slightly to the left or right, effectively bypassing the dense core and safely orbiting inside the empty void. This spatial intuition is completely useless inside the event horizon, because the inward radial dimension has mathematically transformed into the strict forward progression of time. The singularity is no longer a coordinate in physical space. It does not exist at a location you can navigate toward or steer away from. It exists entirely as an upcoming moment in time. Consider how you experience the fundamental progression of a standard day on Earth. No matter where you drive, how fast you run, or what physical direction you face, you cannot avoid the arrival of midnight. Midnight is not a physical wall you crash into. It is an inevitable temporal event that simply arrives to encompass you. Inside the black hole, the singularity is the absolute cosmic midnight. The crushing infinite density of the collapsed star is no longer a physical object waiting patiently below the spacecraft. It is the literal end of time. It is a strict geometric deadline. Every passing second simply brings the physical mass of the spacecraft mathematically closer to this temporal termination point. The ultimate destruction of the machine is not caused by a high-speed collision with a dense physical surface. The geometry of time simply runs out, violently crushing all physical matter out of existence as the timeline strictly concludes. Human biology is fundamentally incapable of naturally visualizing a reality where the future physically terminates. If our terrestrial brains cannot picture this completely inverted temporal geometry, how did theoretical physicists manage to successfully map the exact mechanical fate of our falling probe on a flat sheet of paper? To map this impossible geometry, astrophysicists rely on a brilliant visual tool developed by the British mathematician Roger Penrose in the 1960s. It operates by compressing the entire infinite expanse of space and time onto a single finite piece of paper. The fundamental rule of this diagram is beautifully simple. It dictates that a single photon of light will always travel at exactly a 45-degree angle across the page. Because absolutely no physical object can exceed the speed of light, the physical trajectory of any spacecraft is strictly confined. It must always move at an angle steeper than 45 degrees. You are mathematically forced to travel generally upward on the page, an axis which represents the relentless forward flow of time. When we map the open universe on this diagram, you have the complete freedom to move left or right through space as you continuously travel upward through time. But when we map the extreme gravitational collapse of a supermassive black hole, the rigid angles of light create a perfect geometric trap. The event horizon is drawn as a strict diagonal line, leaning at exactly 45 degrees. When our falling spacecraft crosses this optical threshold, the visual map completely inverts. Inside this new region, the top edge of the diagram no longer represents the infinite future of the open cosmos. The top boundary becomes a solid horizontal ceiling representing the singularity. Because your physical trajectory is forced to remain steeper than the paths of light, every single possible line you can draw from the moment of crossing is strictly funneled directly into that upper horizontal boundary. The diagram visually proves that the singularity is not a physical location you can steer around. It is a strict temporal deadline stretching across your entire possible future. You simply run out of paper. The Penrose diagram elegantly proves the inevitable mechanical destruction of the spacecraft. But physical mass is merely a temporary physical arrangement of fundamental particles. A far more terrifying cosmic crisis emerges when we ask what happens to the underlying quantum data. If the physical machine is crushed completely out of existence at the end of time, does the universe permanently delete the structural information that originally created it? In the early 1970s, classical astrophysics treated the black hole as an eternal tomb. The strict mathematics of general relativity guaranteed that once physical mass crossed the horizon, it was permanently sealed away from the visible universe. A black hole could only grow larger. It could never shrink, and it could certainly never disappear. A young British theoretical physicist named Stephen Hawking fundamentally dismantled this absolute permanence. Hawking recognized a severe blind spot in the classical equations. General relativity flawlessly described the macroscopic architecture of extreme gravity, but it completely ignored the chaotic, microscopic foundation of the universe. To understand the revelation that would eventually fracture modern physics, we must shift our focus away from the immense mass of the collapsed star and look instead at the empty space immediately surrounding it. Our human intuition naturally assumes that empty space is completely hollow. We imagine a perfect vacuum as a silent void containing absolutely nothing. Quantum mechanics dictates a radically different reality. If you could magnify a completely empty region of deep space down to the subatomic scale, you would not find a tranquil void. You would observe a violently boiling sea of energy. The foundational rules of quantum uncertainty permit the universe to spontaneously borrow microscopic amounts of energy from itself. This borrowed energy instantly materializes into a pair of virtual particles, specifically one standard particle of matter and one mirrored particle of antimatter. These pairs flash into existence out of the pure vacuum. They briefly separate, are immediately drawn back together by their opposing charges, and violently annihilate each other. The borrowed energy is perfectly repaid, and the universe rapidly balances its mechanical ledger. This chaotic cycle of creation and destruction happens trillions of times every second, in every single cubic millimeter of empty space across the entire cosmos. In the open emptiness of the interstellar void, this quantum boiling goes entirely unnoticed. The virtual particles simply appear and destroy themselves in perfect mathematical harmony. However, a catastrophic breakdown of conservation occurs when this localized subatomic collision is forced to operate directly on top of the absolute geometric boundary of an event horizon. The absolute boundary of a black hole is a mathematically precise surface. It has zero physical thickness. When the chaotic boiling of the quantum vacuum occurs directly astride this microscopic edge, a severe mechanical fracture takes place. Imagine a pair of virtual particles spontaneously flashing into existence at the exact geometric threshold of the Schwarzschild radius. One particle materializes a fraction of a millimeter inside the boundary, while its mirrored partner materializes a fraction of a millimeter outside, in standard empty space. These two particles would instantly recombine and annihilate each other. But the extreme temporal gradient of the event horizon aggressively intervenes. The particle that spawned inside the boundary is instantly subjected to the inverted geometry of space and time. It is violently dragged toward the inevitable future of the central core. It can never return to the surface to reunite. The particle that spawned just outside the boundary is suddenly left without a partner. It is subjected to an immense gravitational slingshot, and it is forcefully ejected outward into the open vacuum of space. This geometric separation creates a profound accounting problem for the universe. Virtual particles operate entirely on borrowed energy. When the outer particle is forcefully orphaned and propelled into the visible cosmos, it is mandated to become a permanent, physically real particle. This transition demands a strict payment of actual thermodynamic energy, because the cosmos strictly enforces the absolute conservation of energy. It automatically extracts this required payment directly from the gravitational mass of the black hole itself. Stephen Hawking mathematically proved that this localized subatomic theft occurs continuously across the entire spherical surface of the event horizon. Trillions of orphaned particles are violently ejected into deep space every single second. From the perspective of a distant telescope, this relentless outward stream of subatomic particles creates a faint, incredibly cold thermal signature. The black hole is glowing. By emitting this steady stream of subatomic exhaust, now universally classified as Hawking radiation, the collapsed stellar core is actively leaking its physical mass. The absolute permanence dictated by classical physics was a mathematical illusion. A black hole is not an eternal cosmic vault, it is an incredibly slow leak. This revelation mathematically dictates that every single black hole in the cosmos is actively bleeding its mass back into the empty void. They are continuously shrinking, yet the physical timeline required to completely evaporate a supermassive gravitational structure introduces a scale of time so incomprehensibly vast that it renders the entire current age of our universe a mere microscopic fraction of a second. To comprehend the physical timeline of this evaporation, we must detach completely from biological clocks. Our species naturally measures history in centuries, and we measure the current age of our expanding universe at roughly 13.8 billion years. In the mechanical architecture of deep time, 13.8 billion years is barely the opening syllable of a cosmic epoch. Hawking radiation operates on a strict inverse ratio. The more massive a black hole is, the colder its boundary and the slower it leaks. Our chosen supermassive target, containing the physical mass of billions of suns, emits a thermal glow so mathematically weak that its temperature rests merely a fraction of a degree above absolute zero. Because our current universe is bathed in the residual microwave heat of the Big Bang, The black hole is actively absorbing more background radiation from the void than it manages to shed. It is currently gaining mass, but this thermal baseline is strictly temporary. The universe is relentlessly expanding and uniformly cooling. Deep in the unwritten future, the last luminous stars will completely exhaust their nuclear fuel and mechanically extinguish. The glowing galaxies will fade into a frozen expanse. The cosmos will officially enter the black hole era, a vast and silent period where the only surviving macroscopic structures are the invisible geometric membranes of collapsed cores. As the background temperature of the expanding void drops below the microscopic temperature of the event horizon, the thermodynamic ledger will finally tip. The slow, agonizing process of quantum evaporation will begin in earnest. To completely evaporate a single supermassive black hole through Hawking radiation requires a physical timeline of approximately 10 to the power of 100 years. It is a value so mathematically immense that if you were to assign a single atom in the observable universe to represent every passing year, you would exhaust all physical matter long before the timeline concluded. At the exact termination of this incomprehensible epoch, the black hole sheds its final microscopic fraction of physical mass. The severe geometric curvature of space flawlessly flattens. The horizon vanishes permanently in a brief, localized flash of high-energy gamma rays. This structural deletion creates the most devastating mathematical crisis in modern physics. The titanium spacecraft that originally fell across the threshold carried billions of bits of highly structured quantum data. But the thermal radiation that just erased the black hole is entirely randomized, containing absolutely zero structural information. The universe has successfully allowed a physical object to fall into a geometric trap, slowly dismantled the trap itself, and permanently deleted the underlying quantum blueprint. A mechanical conclusion that directly violates the absolute foundation of quantum mechanics. The foundation of modern quantum mechanics relies on a rigid absolute law regarding the preservation of data. To grasp the severity of the crisis triggered by an evaporating black hole, we must first examine how the universe manages physical information on a terrestrial scale. Imagine a thick paper book resting on a wooden table. This book contains thousands of perfectly arranged words, printed in dark ink, describing a highly specific sequence of historical events. From a structural perspective, this book is a dense collection of physical data. Now, introduce a localized heat source and completely burn the book to ash. Human intuition dictates that the specific information contained within the pages has been permanently destroyed. We see nothing but scattered grey dust and drifting smoke. The words are visually gone, but the strict laws of quantum mechanics view this thermal destruction as a mere physical rearrangement. The universe operates as an immaculate mechanical ledger. When the fire consumed the paper, it aggressively broke the chemical bonds holding the molecules together. It scattered the carbon atoms into the atmosphere as smoke and left heavier elements behind as ash. However, the foundational quantum data of every single subatomic particle, its precise spin, its electrical charge, and its localized momentum, was flawlessly preserved during the violent chemical reaction. The information was completely scrambled, but it was never deleted. The rigid mathematical principle of unitarity guarantees this preservation. It dictates that the probability of all possible outcomes in an isolated quantum system must always sum to exactly 100%. Because of this strict probability mandate, the flow of time in quantum equations is mathematically reversible. If you possessed a theoretical supercomputer capable of tracking the precise trajectory and quantum state of every single molecule of smoke, every particle of ash, and every photon of thermal energy released by the fire, you could mathematically run the localized universe in reverse. You could flawlessly reconstruct the exact text of the original book. The cosmos permits you to scramble physical data to an unrecognizable degree, but it strictly prohibits you from erasing the underlying structural blueprint. This unbreakable law is the bedrock of our understanding of reality. Without the absolute conservation of quantum information, the rigid chain of cause and effect simply breaks down, rendering the entire universe a chaotic and unpredictable machine. Yet, when we take this indestructible quantum blueprint and drop it across the silent membrane of an evaporating black hole, the strict logic of the universe violently fractures. The event horizon actively facilitates an act of absolute cosmic erasure. The titanium spacecraft plunging through the phantom membrane is fundamentally a dense package of quantum data. Every single electron in its navigation computers, every proton in its structural hull, and every biological cell of the astronaut inside represents a perfectly arranged sequence of physical information. When this highly structured package crosses the Schwarzschild radius, classical general relativity offers a comforting assurance. The information is permanently hidden behind an unyielding optical curtain, but it remains mechanically safe. It continues to exist within the severely warped geometry of the collapsed space. Hawking radiation violently dismantles that safety because the black hole is slowly evaporating by emitting a steady stream of subatomic particles. We must carefully examine the exact origin of those particles. The thermal glow of Hawking radiation does not originate from the collapsed matter deep inside the black hole. Nothing can cross outward from the interior. The radiation is spawned entirely from the chaotic quantum vacuum situated exactly on the outer edge of the geometric boundary. Consequently, this outward stream of energy is perfectly thermal and completely randomized. It is pure cosmic noise. It carries absolutely zero structural information about the physical matter trapped inside the horizon. It does not know if the gravitational well consumed a titanium spacecraft, a dead star, or an equivalent mass of frozen water. The outgoing radiation simply steals mass from the core and blindly scatters it into the void. When the timeline reaches the exact moment of complete evaporation, the black hole physically vanishes. The localized space it once occupied flawlessly flattens back into an empty vacuum. But the highly structured data of the spacecraft was never encoded into the outgoing thermal radiation, and the internal space where the data was supposedly stored no longer exists. The mathematical ledger of the universe fails to balance. The quantum blueprint has been completely and permanently erased. This localized deletion of data is known as the black hole information paradox. It is not merely an obscure academic puzzle. If the universe actively permits the true destruction of quantum information, the rigid chain of cause and effect breaks down entirely. The foundational rules that allow us to calculate the chemical behavior of atoms, the fusion within stars, and the forward flow of time itself would be rendered mathematically invalid. Modern physics was suddenly fractured. General relativity demanded that the black hole must inevitably evaporate. Quantum mechanics demanded that the information must absolutely survive. They could not both be correct. The resolution to this paradox would require physicists to completely rethink the physical location of reality, ultimately suggesting that the true essence of the spacecraft might not be falling into the dark at all, but rather smeared perfectly across the two-dimensional surface of the horizon. In 1993, theoretical physicists Gerard 't Hooft and Leonard Susskind proposed a radical geometric rescue operation to save the foundation of quantum mechanics. Their solution required humanity to completely abandon the intuitive concept of three-dimensional volume. If you want to store a large amount of physical data, like packing heavy boxes into a large warehouse, terrestrial logic dictates that the storage capacity is defined by the three-dimensional volume of the room. A larger interior volume naturally holds more physical data. For decades, astrophysicists assumed a black hole operated by this exact same spatial logic. They assumed the quantum information of the falling spacecraft was stored somewhere within the vast, dark internal volume of the collapsed star. The mathematics of extreme gravity absolutely rejected this assumption. Calculations regarding black hole entropy revealed a stunning geometric truth. The maximum amount of quantum data a gravitational structure can theoretically hold is not dictated by the volume of its dark interior. It is strictly determined by the total surface area of its event horizon. This mathematical revelation fundamentally redefines the physical nature of the phantom membrane. The Schwarzschild radius is not merely an optical threshold or an empty geometric trap. It is a two-dimensional physical storage medium. It operates as the ultimate cosmic hard drive. When the titanium spacecraft plunges toward the collapsed core, we naturally perceive a three-dimensional machine occupying physical space. But as it intersects the event horizon, the rigid laws of quantum preservation intervene. The physical mass of the spacecraft is permitted to glide seamlessly through the boundary and continue its inevitable trajectory toward the central singularity. However, the underlying quantum blueprint, the precise structural data defining every single atom of the machine, is violently stripped away and forcefully plastered onto the outer boundary. The event horizon is mathematically divided into a microscopic grid. Each individual square on this grid measures exactly 1 Planck length across, a spatial dimension so incredibly small that it represents the absolute pixel resolution of reality itself. Every single Planck square on the spherical surface of the horizon is capable of storing exactly 1 unit of quantum information. The three-dimensional spacecraft is completely flattened. Its entire structural reality is perfectly encoded as two-dimensional data covering the outer skin of the black hole. This mechanism is universally known as the holographic principle. It successfully prevents the localized erasure of the data by keeping the quantum blueprint entirely outside the destructive interior of the gravity well. The physical machine is inevitably crushed at the end of time, but its foundational code remains safely etched on the external surface. Yet keeping the data smeared across a dark sphere does not fully resolve the paradox. The black hole is still actively leaking thermal energy and steadily shrinking. If the horizon eventually evaporates into nothing, how does the two-dimensional data encoded on its shrinking surface actually survive the final deletion? A shrinking spherical surface presents a strict mathematical dilemma. If the total storage capacity of a cosmic hard drive is dictated exclusively by its surface area, a black hole that is actively evaporating must simultaneously lose its physical ability to store data. The event horizon is steadily contracting. The quantum real estate is actively vanishing. The structural code of the spacecraft cannot remain parked on the outer boundary indefinitely. It must somehow transfer onto the outgoing thermal radiation and escape back into the open universe before the surface area completely collapses to zero. The mechanical vehicle for this cosmic extraction relies on the deeply counterintuitive phenomenon of quantum entanglement. When the violently boiling vacuum spawns a pair of virtual particles directly astride the threshold. They do not act as isolated entities. They are born fundamentally linked. The quantum state of the particle dragged inward is mathematically tethered to the quantum state of the particle forcefully ejected outward. They share a unified mechanical existence, regardless of the immense physical distance that rapidly separates them. As the highly structured two-dimensional blueprint of the spacecraft rests perfectly encoded on the Planck scale grid of the event horizon, it physically interacts with the continuous stream of inward-falling virtual particles. The complex structural data of the titanium hull and the biological astronaut fundamentally alters the quantum states of these captured particles. Because of the unbreakable geometric tether of entanglement, This internal interaction instantly dictates the properties of the outgoing thermal radiation. Stephen Hawking initially calculated that the outward stream of Hawking radiation was pure, perfectly randomized thermal noise. But advanced quantum calculations spanning the subsequent decades revealed a microscopic correction. The outgoing photons are not entirely blind. As they are hurled away from the evaporating membrane, their precise quantum states are subtly shifted by the entanglement link. They act as an aggressively encrypted exhaust stream. The cold thermal glow of the black hole is actively carrying the foundational data of the spacecraft back out into the deep void. The universe flawlessly balances its ledger. The physical machine was violently crushed at the end of time, and its underlying quantum data was scattered across the cosmos in a completely unrecognizable format. But absolutely nothing was permanently erased. If you possessed a theoretical supercomputer capable of capturing every single photon of Hawking radiation emitted over a timeline of 10 to the power of 100 years, and you successfully deciphered the staggering web of quantum entanglement binding those photons together, you could mathematically reconstruct the exact structural blueprint of the falling probe. The cosmos permits absolute physical destruction, but it strictly outlaws true deletion. This microscopic quantum escape resolves the most severe paradox in modern astrophysics. Yet in saving the rigid foundation of causality, the holographic principle forces humanity to confront a far more disturbing implication about the architecture of reality itself. If the three-dimensional physical existence of a spacecraft can be flawlessly reduced to a two-dimensional projection on a dark spherical membrane, we are forced to ask if the open universe we currently inhabit operates by the exact same geometric illusion. Theoretical physicists rarely confine a successful mathematical framework to a single localized anomaly. If the rigid laws of quantum mechanics dictate that a black hole operates as a two-dimensional storage surface, projecting a three-dimensional illusion, the mathematics actively encourage us to turn our perspective outward. We must look away from the collapsed stellar core and examine the vast, expanding architecture of the cosmos itself. Our observable universe is strictly bounded by a cosmological horizon. Because the cosmos has a finite age and light travels at a strictly finite speed, there is a definitive spherical boundary marking the absolute limit of what we can mechanically observe, much like the event horizon of a black hole. This distant cosmological boundary represents an insurmountable optical and physical threshold. When astrophysicists apply the mathematics of black hole entropy to the entire observable universe, the calculations yield a deeply unsettling symmetry. The maximum amount of quantum data that our entire cosmos can theoretically contain is not determined by its staggering three-dimensional volume. It is strictly dictated by the total surface area of its outer cosmological boundary. The mathematical logic perfectly mirrors the phantom membrane of the dead star. This realization violently displaces our biological perception of reality. Look at the physical space surrounding you. You perceive the distinct architectural depth of a room, the vast three-dimensional distance between galaxies, and the biological volume of your own hands. You feel the mechanical weight of gravity anchoring you to a terrestrial floor. Classical physics conditioned humanity to believe that this three-dimensional space is the fundamental arena of nature. The holographic principle suggests that this physical depth is an incredibly convincing cosmic illusion. The true foundational reality of the universe might not be a three-dimensional arena at all. The exact structural blueprint of every single star, every planetary body, and every biological organism currently alive could be perfectly encoded as a two-dimensional matrix of quantum data, resting entirely on the flat, distant boundary of the observable cosmos. What we perceive as daily physical existence, the act of moving freely through space and experiencing the forward flow of time, is merely a localized holographic projection generated by that distant mathematical code. In this radical framework, gravity and spatial dimensions are no longer foundational forces of nature. They are emergent properties. They are merely the physical symptoms of quantum data interacting on a flat membrane at the edge of the void. We have successfully resolved the paradox of the black hole by mathematically erasing the fundamental depth of the universe itself. But if space and time are merely holographic projections, we must finally address the single most terrifying mechanic of extreme gravity. What exactly happens when the physical projection of space is stretched so violently that the underlying quantum code physically tears apart? Albert Einstein's field equations are the most successful predictive tools in the history of astrophysics. They flawlessly map the gentle gravitational curves guiding the orbits of galaxies, and they accurately predict the severe temporal gradients at the edge of an event horizon. But they are strictly macroscopic instruments. They are fundamentally not invincible. At the absolute geometric center of a black hole, the mathematics experience a catastrophic mechanical failure. As the collapsing mass of a dead star is aggressively crushed inward, it is forced down into a physical volume of exactly zero. When general relativity attempts to calculate the gravitational intensity of this zero-dimensional point, the density variable violently skyrockets to infinity. The geometric curvature of spacetime becomes infinitely sharp. In applied physics, infinity is an alarm bell. It is the exact coordinate where the theory breaks. A curvature that reaches infinity is no longer a slope, a steep gradient, or a vertical temporal wall. It is a severe, localized puncture in the fundamental fabric of reality. The smooth, continuous membrane of spacetime physically tears open. At this microscopic coordinate, the known laws of the cosmos simply cease to function. General relativity completely loses its predictive power, and the standard model of quantum mechanics refuses to incorporate extreme gravity into its framework. To map the true physical nature of this tear, humanity requires a unified theory of quantum gravity, a flawless mathematical bridge between the cosmic and the subatomic realms that currently remains undiscovered. Yet the mere mathematical existence of this puncture forced theoretical physicists to confront a profound structural anomaly. If the fabric of the universe is actively torn open at the singularity, where does the bottom of the funnel actually lead? In 1935, Einstein and his colleague Nathan Rosen attempted to follow the mathematics directly into the tear. They discovered that the equations permitted a bizarre geometric workaround. The math suggested that the severe downward funnel of the black hole did not strictly have to terminate in a dead, infinitely dense point. Instead, the puncture could theoretically attach itself to a mirrored geometric structure, an inverted gravitational funnel where space and time violently expand outward. The tear in our localized space could seamlessly connect to another tear in a completely different region of the cosmos. They had mathematically mapped a subspatial tunnel. It was a structural bridge connecting two vastly distant cosmic coordinates, bypassing the linear restrictions of the universe entirely. This architectural anomaly is formally known as an Einstein-Rosen bridge. Today, the broader culture knows it as a wormhole. But discovering the mathematical existence of a door is vastly different from being able to walk through it. The geometry of this cosmic bridge demands a structural stability that the natural universe refuses to provide, immediately turning this theoretical shortcut into a violently unstable trap. The mathematics of general relativity contain a strict temporal symmetry. If you take the exact equations that govern the localized collapse of a black hole and run the flow of time in absolute reverse, the math successfully produces a mirrored geometric structure. Astrophysicists call it a white hole. If a black hole is a region of space where gravity is so intense that nothing can escape, a white hole is a region where gravity is so intensely inverted that nothing can ever enter. Its event horizon operates as an absolute outward boundary. It acts as a cosmic geyser, violently expelling space, time, and raw energy into the open universe. In the theoretical architecture of an Einstein-Rosen bridge, these two extreme structures are permanently linked. The black hole serves as the inescapable entrance, the subspatial throat serves as the connecting tunnel, and the white hole serves as the exit. Cinematic science fiction relies entirely on this geometric hallway remaining stable. The brutal mechanics of the actual universe absolutely guarantee its immediate destruction. The theoretical tunnel only exists in a state of perfect, pristine emptiness. It cannot tolerate the presence of actual physical energy. The precise moment our titanium spacecraft, or even a single stray photon of background starlight, crosses the threshold and enters the throat of the wormhole, the fragile mathematical architecture violently collapses. Gravity is a highly reactive medium. When foreign mass enters the subspatial tunnel, it introduces its own localized gravitational pull. In the extreme geometry of the throat, this minute addition of energy triggers an immediate and catastrophic feedback loop. The light entering the tunnel alongside the spacecraft is aggressively blue-shifted, compounding its energy toward infinity. This sudden infinite spike in radiation violently distorts the local spacetime. The walls of the throat forcefully pinch shut. Strict calculations dictate that the speed of this structural collapse is mathematically absolute. The tunnel pinches off and destroys itself significantly faster than a photon of light can travel from the entrance to the exit. Even if a spacecraft plunged into the black hole, traveling at the absolute maximum speed permitted by the cosmos, the bridge would successfully sever itself before the nose of the ship ever reached the other side. The Einstein-Rosen bridge is not a cosmic highway. It is a gravitational guillotine. The physical mass of the spacecraft is permanently crushed at the exact coordinate where the tunnel violently breaks apart. Classical astrophysics definitively closes the door on interstellar shortcuts, mathematically proving that a naturally occurring wormhole is a lethal trap. Yet, the theoretical drive to bypass the vast, empty distances of the universe demands a geometric solution. If natural gravity actively crushes the bridge, the only remaining option is to mathematically engineer a synthetic mechanism to forcefully hold the throat open, requiring a physical substance so deeply unnatural that it fundamentally violates the standard laws of thermodynamics. Preventing the collapse of a subspatial tunnel requires a physical intervention that actively defies the natural behavior of mass. Every known element in the periodic table and every glowing star in the cosmos possesses positive mass. Positive mass strictly generates an attractive gravitational field. It bends space inward. When introduced to the incredibly fragile geometry of a wormhole, this inward curvature acts as the crushing force that violently snaps the throat shut. To hold the tunnel open, a theoretical architect must construct a scaffold using a substance that generates the exact opposite geometric effect. They require a material with a negative energy density. Theoretical physicists classify this requirement as exotic matter. It is mathematically crucial to separate this concept from antimatter. Antimatter violently annihilates upon contact with regular particles, but it still fundamentally possesses positive mass. It produces attractive gravity. Exotic matter operates under a completely inverted mechanical framework. Because its mass value drops below zero, it generates gravitational repulsion. If you were to release a sphere of exotic matter on the surface of the Earth, it would not drop to the floor. It would actively fall upward, forcefully repelled by the mass of the planet. By completely lining the interior throat of the wormhole with this repulsive substance, the outward anti-gravitational pressure would mathematically counteract the inward collapse. The exotic scaffold would forcefully hold the jaws of the singularity open, providing a perfectly stable, unmoving corridor for a spacecraft to transit. While this architectural proposal sounds indistinguishable from cinematic fantasy, it is strictly anchored in mainstream quantum mechanics. In 1948, Dutch physicist Hendrik Casimir demonstrated that negative energy density is a highly measurable physical phenomenon. By placing two uncharged, highly polished metallic plates incredibly close together in a perfect vacuum, the microscopic gap physically restricts the chaotic boiling of virtual particles. The restricted space between the plates mathematically contains less thermodynamic energy than the standard empty vacuum surrounding them. The energy state drops below zero. The universe strictly permits the existence of the exotic scaffold required to hold a wormhole open. It simply confines this negative energy to a subatomic scale. To stabilize a macroscopic cosmic bridge, humanity would need to evolve far beyond the passive observation of astrophysics. It would demand the birth of gravitational engineering. An advanced civilization would need to develop the mechanical infrastructure to harvest, amplify, and physically weave this microscopic quantum anomaly into vast astronomical structures. If a civilization successfully engineers this stable doorway, they achieve a mastery over reality that extends far beyond traversing interstellar distances. Because the fundamental fabric of space and time is inextricably unified, successfully stabilizing a physical bridge through space immediately grants the mechanical ability to manipulate the flow of time, forcing the cosmos to actively defend itself against the ultimate violation of causality. Place two stable wormhole entrances, Mouth A and Mouth B, in a synchronized orbit around a silent planet. The exotic matter scaffold holds the subspatial tunnel perfectly open. At this initial stage, both doorways tick at the exact same temporal rate. If an astronaut steps into Mouth A, they instantly emerge from Mouth B in the exact same present moment. It is merely a spatial shortcut. Now we introduce the severe mechanics of special relativity. We detach Mouth B and secure it to a propulsion drive capable of accelerating to 99% of the speed of light. We launch it on a vast high-speed trajectory across the stellar neighborhood, while Mouth A remains completely stationary in its original orbit. The inflexible laws of physics dictate that extreme velocity aggressively slows the localized progression of time. As Mouth B accelerates through the void, its internal clock drags. When the propulsion drive completes its journey and returns Mouth B to park directly beside Mouth A, a catastrophic temporal fracture has been engineered. For the stationary Mouth A, 10 years have elapsed. For the violently accelerating Mouth B, only 1 year has passed. The two doorways are now resting physically side by side in the vacuum of space, but they are entirely divorced in time. However, the internal subspatial tunnel connecting them completely ignores the chronological state of the external universe. The throat of the wormhole still links the two mouths instantly. If a pilot steps into Mouth B, the doorway that experienced significantly less time, they will transit the tunnel and instantly emerge from Mouth A precisely 9 years in the past. The spatial bridge has been successfully weaponized into a chronology machine. Theoretical physicists define this looped geometry as a closed time-like curve. It mathematically permits physical matter to travel backward along its own timeline, granting an observer the mechanical ability to directly interact with their own history. This capability instantly triggers the total collapse of causality. Consider the logical fracture universally known as the grandfather paradox. If the pilot utilizes the chronological machine to travel 9 years into the past, they possess the physical agency to locate and violently destroy the propulsion drive before it ever accelerates Mouth B. If the drive is destroyed in the past, the time machine is never constructed. But if the machine is never constructed, the pilot could never have traveled backward to destroy it. The foundational logic of the cosmos shatters. The universe is violently forced into an irreconcilable loop where a specific physical event is simultaneously caused and permanently prevented. Mainstream quantum mechanics strictly prohibits this scale of mathematical contradiction. The universe demands absolute chronological order. If the fundamental laws of physics absolutely refuse to tolerate a paradox, nature must possess a localized defense mechanism capable of recognizing a time machine and actively destroying it before a passenger can ever step through. In 1992, Stephen Hawking recognized that the mathematical existence of a closed time-like curve posed a fatal structural threat to a rational cosmos. If the equations of general relativity permitted the engineering of a time machine, the universe required an aggressive immune response to prevent the absolute collapse of causality. Hawking formally mapped this defense mechanism. He named it the chronology protection conjecture, the mechanism the universe utilizes to destroy a chronological loop. Relies entirely on the violently boiling quantum vacuum. Empty space is never truly empty. It is continuously teeming with virtual particles flashing in and out of existence. Consider the exact macroscopic moment the accelerating wormhole mouth returns to park beside the stationary mouth. Officially bridging the 9-year chronological gap, a single microscopic photon of ambient background radiation drifts into the younger doorway. It transits the subspatial tunnel and instantly emerges from the older doorway exactly 9 years in the past. Because both doorways are resting in the exact same physical orbit, this photon simply drifts through standard space for 9 years, waiting for the timeline to naturally catch up. When the 9 years elapse, the photon arrives back at the exact physical moment it originally entered the tunnel. It enters the wormhole a second time, but now it is perfectly accompanied by its own younger self. Both photons transit the tunnel, travel back 9 years, and wait to enter again. 2 become 4, 4 become 8. They exponentially multiply in a flawless geometric progression. This mechanic precisely mirrors the deafening acoustic screech generated when a live microphone is placed too close to a speaker. The time machine creates an infinite quantum feedback loop. The virtual particles of the boiling vacuum relentlessly cycle through the timeline, aggressively compounding their thermodynamic energy with every single transit. The physical time required for this feedback loop to reach infinity is mathematically zero. At the precise fraction of a second, the chronology machine successfully forms. The quantum radiation inside the throat instantaneously spikes to an infinite density. This catastrophic surge of thermal energy violently vaporizes the exotic matter scaffold. It instantly incinerates the subspatial bridge. The geometric tunnel aggressively pinches shut long before a human passenger could ever step toward the threshold. Hawking mathematically proved that the universe actively defends its own history. The laws of physics operate as a strict chronological quarantine. They permit space to be severely warped, they allow the flow of time to be aggressively stretched, and they even tolerate the total physical destruction of matter. But causality remains an absolute fortress. The universe absolutely refuses to allow an effect to precede its own cause. The chronology protection conjecture beautifully restores the logical order of reality. However, it leaves humanity standing safely on the outside of the dark boundary, forced to accept that the ultimate architectural secrets buried at the end of time are permanently sealed away. The human eye naturally equates darkness with an absence of information. We began this journey by staring at a microscopic circular shadow silhouetted against a violently glowing disk of superheated gas. To the unassisted observer, it is merely a void in the cosmos, a dead zone where light permanently fails. But through the rigid lens of theoretical physics, that shadow is the most densely informative structure in the natural universe. We will never physically travel across the event horizon. The severe mathematics of the Schwarzschild radius strictly prohibit any causal return, and the relentless chronology protection conjecture guarantees that any attempt to bypass the geometry will be met with instant localized destruction. The singularity at the absolute center of the dark remains a physical destination permanently quarantined from human biology. Yet this isolation makes the achievement of modern astrophysics all the more staggering. We are a temporary biological arrangement of carbon atoms anchored to a small rocky planet, orbiting an entirely unremarkable star. But without ever leaving the gravitational safety of our terrestrial orbit, the human intellect successfully mapped the unseeable. We utilized the unbreakable laws of thermodynamics and quantum mechanics to dissect the phantom membrane. We proved that space and time are fluid, exchangeable dimensions. We decoded the holographic architecture of reality, proving that the universe can violently crush a physical machine without ever deleting its foundational blueprint. We have successfully illuminated the dark. But the most profound revelation hidden within the architecture of a black hole is not how it crushes matter, it is how it ultimately dies. When we project the timeline forward to the absolute end of the black hole era, 10 to the power of 100 years into the unwritten future, the final supermassive structure will shed its last fraction of quantum data. The horizon will flatten, evaporating into a brief silent flash of gamma radiation. We must carefully examine the cosmos that is left behind. Once the final black hole evaporates, the universe will be completely devoid of physical mass. There will be no glowing stars, no rocky planets, and no structural atoms. The observable cosmos will contain absolutely nothing but scattered, drifting photons of light, stretching across an infinitely expanding, freezing vacuum. Human intuition views this dark, freezing expanse as the ultimate eternal death of reality. The mathematics of Sir Roger Penrose dictate a stunning geometric resurrection. According to the laws of relativity, a photon of light possesses absolutely no mass. Because it lacks mass, it does not experience the flow of time, nor does it recognize the physical geometry of distance. In a universe containing only light, the physical concepts of space and time completely lose their structural meaning. Without physical matter to act as a ruler or a clock, the mathematical distinction between infinitely large and infinitely small simply ceases to exist. An infinitely expanded, freezing, massless cosmos is geometrically indistinguishable from a microscopic, infinitely hot, dense singularity. The absolute end of time is not a silent graveyard. It is a perfect geometric reset. The final evaporation of the last black hole does not mark the death of the universe. It provides the precise mathematical prerequisite to ignite a brand new Big Bang. 10 to the power of 100 years in the unwritten future, the physical universe is a silent, completely exhausted machine. The biological era of humanity has been dead for an eternity. The luminous era of fusion-burning stars extinguished trillions of years ago. Even the chaotic corpses of dead galaxies, the rogue planets, the freezing brown dwarfs, and the shattered neutron stars have long since decayed into subatomic dust. The only surviving macroscopic structures in the entire cosmos are the immense invisible gravitational membranes of supermassive black holes. For an incomprehensible span of deep time, they have drifted in absolute darkness, slowly bleeding their physical mass into the freezing void through the microscopic leak of Hawking radiation. But even a black hole is not eternal. Deep in the expanding vacuum, a sudden microscopic flash of high-energy gamma rays violently pierces the absolute dark. It lasts only a fraction of a second. Then the true eternal silence begins. The physical universe does not end in a catastrophic, tearing cosmic collapse. It ends with a quiet, localized flash, but the mathematics of extreme geometry suggest that this absolute darkness is not a graveyard. It is a strictly required mechanical prerequisite. The evaporation of a black hole is a process governed by a brutal inverse thermodynamic curve. For the vast majority of its lifespan, a supermassive black hole is incredibly cold and strictly stable. It leaks its mass back into the universe at a glacial pace, emitting a thermal glow so weak it registers at a mere fraction of a degree above absolute zero. But as the centuries relentlessly compound, stretching into trillions of millennia, the mass of the collapsed star slowly decreases. As the physical mass drops, the geometric surface area of the event horizon shrinks. And as the horizon contracts, the laws of quantum mechanics force the temperature of the boundary to aggressively rise. This inverse relationship guarantees a violent mathematical conclusion. The smaller the black hole becomes, the faster it burns. What began as a microscopic, agonizingly slow subatomic leak gradually accelerates into a roaring cosmic fire. In the final milliseconds of its existence, the shrinking event horizon becomes unimaginably hot. The gravitational well that once possessed the strength to rip a star to shreds completely loses its structural integrity. The phantom membrane forcefully collapses inward, and the remaining mass of the singularity detonates outward in a concentrated, perfectly spherical shockwave of gamma radiation. This final thermal flash effectively acts as the absolute deletion of gravity. When the last supermassive black hole evaporates, the fundamental architecture of reality experiences a permanent transition. The universe is officially purged of all baryonic matter. There is not a single proton left in existence. There are no carbon atoms, no metallic asteroids, and no gravitational wells to warp the fabric of space. The cosmos is now entirely composed of an infinitely expanding vacuum, populated exclusively by drifting massless photons of light and the dissipating thermal radiation of dead stars. Classical astrophysics views this exact coordinate in deep time as the heat death of the universe. It is formally considered the ultimate thermodynamic symmetry. Because there is no longer any physical mass to generate gravitational friction or chemical reactions, absolutely no mechanical work can ever be performed again. The cosmic engine has exhausted its fuel, but evaluating this dark expanse as a dead universe requires us to look at it through the perspective of structural matter. If we completely abandon the perspective of physical mass and examine this vast, freezing void exclusively through the mechanical experience of a photon of light, the mathematics reveal a deeply unsettling architectural secret. The spatial grid of the cosmos continues to expand, driven relentlessly by the outward pressure of dark energy. But this cosmic mechanism is now operating on a perfectly empty room. In the luminous era of the universe, space was defined by localized concentrations of extreme mass. Stars, nebulae, and galactic superclusters created deep gravitational valleys, warping the geometry of reality into a complex, uneven topography. Now, without a single atom of baryonic matter remaining to anchor gravity, the fundamental fabric of spacetime completely relaxes. It flattens into a pristine, featureless sheet. The only occupants of this flat void are the residual photons of light, the scattered, chaotic thermal debris of the final black hole evaporations. These photons are hopelessly caught within the rapidly expanding grid. As the underlying physical space violently stretches, the light itself is mechanically pulled apart. Astrophysicists classify this structural stretching as cosmological redshift. The wavelength of a single photon is relentlessly elongated, forcefully draining its thermodynamic energy into the expanding void. Deep in the heat death, a single wave of light might be stretched so severely that the physical distance from its peak to its trough spans billions of light years. The ambient temperature of the cosmos plunges exponentially, asymptotically approaching absolute zero, but is mathematically forbidden from ever truly reaching it. This is the absolute architecture of nothingness. It is a frictionless, freezing expanse dominated entirely by massless radiation. Human intuition fundamentally rejects this environment because our biological brains strictly require structural landmarks. We define physical space exclusively by measuring the distance between solid objects. We comprehend the vastness of a room by looking at its solid walls, and we map the scale of a galaxy by measuring the empty distance between its burning stars. In this terminal epoch, the physical walls have been permanently deleted. There are no structural landmarks remaining in reality. A photon drifting through this void encounters absolutely no physical resistance, no gravitational wells, and no solid surfaces to strike. It travels in a perfectly straight geometric line across an infinitely expanding dark. But this creates a fatal mechanical flaw in the logic of the universe. Without a single piece of structural matter left in the cosmos to act as a physical reference point, the geometric concept of distance completely breaks down. If there is no matter left to anchor a measurement between point A and point B, the concept of spatial scale becomes a mathematical ghost. The universe is infinitely large, yet strictly speaking, physical size has completely lost its mechanical meaning. This spatial collapse is merely the first structural casualty of the heat death. By permanently stripping the cosmos of physical mass, the universe has inadvertently dismantled the only mechanical instrument capable of measuring the forward flow of reality itself. Every mechanical instrument ever constructed to measure time relies on one fundamental physical property: mass. A swinging brass pendulum, the vibrating quartz crystal in a wristwatch, and the radioactive decay of a cesium atom all require massive particles interacting through physical space. Mass generates inertia. Inertia forcefully restricts velocity, keeping physical objects traveling strictly below the absolute speed of light. According to the inflexible laws of special relativity, traveling slower than light is the exact mechanical requirement for experiencing the forward flow of time. To possess mass is to possess a physical clock, but the final thermal flash of the last supermassive black hole permanently stripped the universe of this fundamental property. The heat death is defined by a complete absence of massive particles. The surviving photons drifting through the infinitely expanding void possess absolutely zero rest mass. This singular mathematical absence triggers a fatal collapse in the chronological architecture of the cosmos. Because a photon has no mass to generate inertia, it is mechanically forced to travel at the absolute speed limit of reality. At this maximum velocity, the relativistic effect of time dilation is not merely severe, it is mathematically infinite. The internal timeline of the particle is completely compressed. From the localized perspective of a photon, the internal clock is permanently frozen. A particle of light does not age. It does not experience the passage of centuries, nor does it feel the agonizing stretch of an expanding cosmic epoch. For a massless particle, the exact moment of its violent creation and the moment it ultimately fades into the void occur in the precise same temporal instant. By purging the cosmos of all baryonic matter, the universe has successfully eliminated every single localized observer. There is no biological entity to watch the dark energy stretch the grid, and no titanium spacecraft to measure the expanding temperature drops. If every remaining occupant of the cosmos is entirely blind to the passage of time, the physical dimension of time simply ceases to exist. A clock requires a mechanical change of state to tick from 1 second to the next. In a universe containing exclusively light and a frozen vacuum, no new physical events can ever occur. The narrative of the cosmos is finished. This timeless, massless, infinitely vast expanse represents the ultimate graveyard of classical physics. The universe has successfully reached a state of absolute mechanical paralysis. Yet this exact state of perfect, unchanging emptiness triggers a severe structural contradiction with the most rigid law of the natural world. By completely erasing its physical mass, the dead universe has unknowingly engineered a fatal anomaly in the fundamental ledger of thermodynamics. The fundamental flow of reality is strictly one-directional. At the microscopic quantum level, the foundational equations of physics are completely time-reversible. The mathematical mechanics governing the collision of two isolated subatomic particles function flawlessly, regardless of whether the timeline is running forward or backward. But when we zoom out to the macroscopic scale, where trillions of particles interact to form stars, planets, and human biology, this perfect temporal symmetry violently collapses. If you observe a dead star forcefully detonating into a supernova, You are witnessing an irreversible mechanical transaction. The scattered thermal energy will never spontaneously reverse its trajectory, rush back into the center of the void, and reforge the perfect metallic core of a star. This absolute physical restriction is governed by the second law of thermodynamics. It is the single most inflexible mandate in modern astrophysics, operating strictly on the mathematical concept of entropy. Entropy is the fundamental measure of physical disorder. It defines exactly how thermal energy and structural data are distributed within a closed system. The second law dictates that the total entropy of an isolated universe can never decrease. It must relentlessly rise. A highly structured, concentrated energy source like a pristine hydrogen nebula or the dense core of a young galaxy represents a state of extremely low entropy. As those structures burn, collide, and eventually collapse, their concentrated energy is forcefully scattered into the surrounding vacuum as ambient heat and chaotic radiation. The overall energy of the cosmos is never destroyed, but its architectural arrangement becomes permanently disorganized. In 1927, British astrophysicist Arthur Eddington formally classified this relentless decay as the arrow of time. While the three dimensions of physical space allow an observer to move freely in multiple directions, the thermodynamic ledger strictly forbids any reverse motion through the temporal dimension. The physical future is strictly defined as the direction in which cosmic entropy increases. Time only flows forward because the universe is mathematically trapped in a continuous, unstoppable tumble toward absolute chaos. Every nuclear fusion reaction, every orbital decay, and every evaporating event horizon adds an irreversible payment to this cosmic debt. The arrow of time is a brutal mechanical march that dictates the entire chronological history of reality. This strict thermodynamic progression brings us directly back to the freezing, massless graveyard of the heat deaths. When the final supermassive black hole detonated into a brief flash of gamma radiation, it finalized the ultimate cosmic transaction. The universe successfully scattered the very last fraction of its organized energy. By dissolving all physical mass and leaving nothing but drifting cold photons, the cosmos officially arrived at a state of maximum possible entropy. But this creates a severe mathematical paradox. The arrow of time requires a constant thermodynamic gradient, a continuous slide from order to chaos to physically propel reality forward. When the expanding universe finally reaches absolute maximum entropy, that thermodynamic slide hits a permanent flat floor. Maximum entropy is mathematically defined as a state of perfect equilibrium. Throughout the active lifespan of the cosmos, thermodynamic energy is severely unbalanced. It is clumped into furiously burning stars, condensed into dense planetary cores, and crushed into supermassive black holes, leaving vast expanses of the interstellar void completely empty. This severe imbalance is exactly what drives the mechanical engine of reality. Energy relentlessly flows from regions of intense concentrated heat to regions of absolute cold. This continuous transfer is what powers stellar fusion, planetary weather systems, and biological life. When the universe officially enters the heat death, this transfer is permanently halted. The total evaporation of the final event horizon successfully scatters the last remaining pocket of concentrated mass. The surviving photons and the residual thermal radiation are ruthlessly stretched by the expanding grid of dark energy. Over an incomprehensible stretch of deep time, this radiation is smeared with absolute mathematical perfection across the entire infinite volume of the cosmos. Eventually, every single cubic meter of the expanding void contains the exact same microscopic trace of thermal energy. There is no longer a hot region to emit energy, and no cold region to absorb it. The temperature of reality becomes flawlessly uniform. In classical thermodynamics, this state of absolute uniformity is the literal definition of maximum entropy. But this establishes a profound geometric irony. The arrow of time dictates that the universe must relentlessly decay from order into ultimate chaos. Yet when the cosmos finally achieves this mathematical peak of absolute disorder, it does not physically resemble a chaotic, turbulent wasteland. It manifests as a perfectly smooth, featureless, and completely unchanging sheet. This perfect equilibrium executes the final thermodynamic death blow to the concept of time. Because there is absolutely no difference in temperature anywhere in the void, thermal energy cannot flow. Without the flow of energy, no mechanical work can ever be performed. Without mechanical work, the physical state of the universe cannot change. The arrow of time fundamentally relies on the ability of an observer to distinguish the past from the future. In a universe experiencing active entropy, yesterday is highly structured and tomorrow is slightly more chaotic. But in a universe paralyzed at perfect maximum entropy, tomorrow will be mechanically identical to yesterday. The exact same uniform distribution of cold photons will persist for an eternity. Because the physical future can no longer be distinguished from the physical past, the thermodynamic arrow completely shatters. The universe is now a flawless, timeless, and completely massless void. It is a dead, empty mathematical slate. But if we leave this freezing graveyard and trace the shattered arrow of time all the way backward to its absolute origin, 14 billion years in the past, we are forced to confront the single greatest structural flaw in the standard model of the Big Bang. Standard cosmological models dictate that reality ignited exactly 13.8 billion years ago from a microscopic, infinitely dense singularity. In the absolute fraction of a second following this ignition, the cosmos was a violently turbulent furnace. It was packed with superheated plasma, chaotic radiation, and a furious storm of colliding subatomic particles. Human intuition looks at this primordial explosion and naturally perceives the ultimate definition of chaos. A violently expanding fireball should mathematically represent a state of extreme, unbridled entropy. The fundamental laws of thermodynamics strictly reject this assumption. If the Big Bang actually originated in a state of high entropy, the mechanical engine of the universe would have stalled immediately upon creation. There would be no thermodynamic gradient available to drive the formation of structural reality. The raw energy of the cosmos would have simply scattered into a uniform, featureless haze. Galaxies would never have coalesced, and fusion-burning stars would never have ignited. For the arrow of time to march forward and for complex gravitational structures to physically form, the universe was strictly mandated to begin its existence in a state of immaculate, highly organized order. The starting line of the Big Bang required an incredibly low state of entropy. This requirement exposes the single most severe flaw in classical cosmology. How does a violently hot, microscopic explosion naturally possess a pristine, highly organized thermodynamic ledger? Sir Roger Penrose mathematically calculated the precise probability of our universe naturally achieving this required low-entropy initial state purely by random quantum fluctuation. The resulting fraction is 1 divided by 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. This value is so incomprehensibly minuscule that if you attempted to write it out by placing a 0 on every single proton in the observable universe, you would exhaust all physical matter long before completing the number. The mathematical implication is absolute. The pristine initial conditions of the Big Bang were not a random cosmic accident. The standard model offers absolutely no physical mechanism to explain this perfectly ordered genesis. It merely accepts it as an unexplainable starting condition. But the architecture of reality does not tolerate miracles. If the thermodynamic ledger was flawlessly reset at the exact moment of the Big Bang, providing a perfectly smooth slate for the arrow of time to begin its forward march, there must be a rigid mechanical process responsible for the deletion of the previous chaos. To discover this reset mechanism, we must bridge the mathematical gap between the freezing dead vacuum of the heat death and the superheated, low entropy singularity of the Big Bang, we must observe the geometry of the cosmos entirely through the perspective of a particle that completely ignores the passage of time. The constant c in the equations of relativity is universally recognized as the speed of light. But this title is fundamentally misleading. The numerical value of 186,000 miles per second is not uniquely tied to photons. Light simply happens to travel at this exact velocity because it possesses absolutely zero rest mass. Any fundamental particle born into the cosmos without physical mass is mechanically forced to operate at this absolute threshold. It cannot accelerate from a resting state, and it cannot decelerate to a halt. It enters reality operating at maximum velocity. To comprehend why this strict limitation exists, we must stop viewing it as a mere measurement of speed. It is the absolute speed of causality. It is the maximum rate at which the universe is mathematically permitted to update its own structural data. If our local sun were to violently vanish from the center of the solar system, human intuition suggests that the Earth would instantly be flung into the dark interstellar void. But the foundational laws of physics strictly prohibit an instantaneous reaction. The gravitational tether anchoring the Earth in orbit and the thermal radiation illuminating its surface are both bound by the cosmic speed limit. For 8 unbroken minutes, the Earth would continue to flawlessly orbit a star that no longer exists. The planet would remain perfectly bathed in warmth and sunlight, entirely blind to the catastrophic structural deletion that just occurred 93 million miles away. During those 8 minutes, the physical effect is completely severed from its cause. The speed limit of reality acts as a strict mechanical firewall. It guarantees that the transmission of information, whether it is a photon of light, a ripple of gravity, or a magnetic field, can never outrun the physical event that created it. Because this numerical limit is absolute and unbreakable, the universe is forced to execute extreme geometric compromises to protect it. When a physical object accelerates closer to this maximum speed, the cosmos does not allow the object to simply push through the barrier. Instead, the universe actively warps the physical dimensions surrounding the moving object. The localized flow of time drastically drags, and the physical space stretching out ahead of the trajectory aggressively compresses. For a biological passenger inside a massive titanium spacecraft, these relativistic distortions are measurable but manageable, but for a massless particle of light permanently locked at the absolute speed of causality, the geometric distortion reaches a catastrophic mathematical extreme. Before Albert Einstein revolutionized our understanding of gravity, Dutch physicist Hendrik Lorentz developed a series of mathematical transformations to explain how electromagnetic fields behave at extreme velocities. These equations revealed a deeply unsettling mechanical truth. Physical space is not a rigid, unmoving stage. It is highly elastic. When a physical object accelerates, the spatial grid lying directly in its path forcefully compresses. This is not an optical illusion. The actual measurable distance between two physical coordinates strictly shrinks. For a human observer traveling aboard a spacecraft at 99% the speed of light, a journey across a vast interstellar void would physically measure significantly shorter than it would for someone remaining completely stationary on a terrestrial planet. But a photon of light does not travel at 99% of the maximum limit. Because it completely lacks physical mass, it is mechanically forced to operate at exactly 186,000 miles per second at this absolute threshold. The Lorentz transformations do not just describe severe spatial compression. The mathematics are pushed to an absolute limit. The physical dimension ahead of the traveling photon mathematically collapses to exactly zero. We must completely discard our biological intuition and attempt to visualize the cosmos entirely from the perspective of this drifting massless particle. Consider a single photon violently ejected from the evaporating event horizon of a dying supermassive black hole. A stationary observer equipped with a theoretical telescope would calculate that this photon must drift for trillions of years across an infinitely expanding freezing vacuum. The photon itself experiences a violently different mechanical reality, because the physical distance between its exact point of origin and its ultimate destination has contracted to zero. The photon does not experience a physical journey. From the perspective of light, the entire universe is completely flat. There is absolutely no geometric gap between the dead core of a collapsed star and the furthest edge of the cosmic boundary. Space itself is rendered entirely obsolete. This geometric realization completely destroys our classical understanding of the physical world. If a dead universe, completely purged of all physical mass, is entirely populated by drifting particles that recognize absolutely no spatial distance and experience absolutely no flow of time, the cosmos is no longer an expanding three-dimensional void. In the strict language of extreme mathematics, the infinite freezing universe has physically morphed into a single microscopic point. When a physical clock accelerates toward the maximum speed limit of causality, its internal mechanism radically slows down. For a biological observer, the ticking of a second significantly stretches out, but for a particle of light, operating exactly at the absolute threshold of 186,000 miles per second, the ticking completely stops. In the strict framework of relativistic mechanics, the passage of time experienced by a traveling object is defined as proper time. For a massless photon, the mathematical value of its proper time is exactly zero. This means a particle of light does not physically age. It possesses absolutely no mechanical capacity to experience the past or anticipate the future. When a photon is violently expelled from the evaporating horizon of the final supermassive black hole and drifts across a freezing vacuum for 10 to the power of 100 years before finally fading into the cosmic background, that staggering chronological journey simply does not exist for the particle. From the strict geometric perspective of the photon, the precise moment of its explosive creation and the exact moment of its final dissolution occur in the identical temporal instant. It is a timeless entity trapped in an eternal present. Now, we must apply this extreme localized reality to the entire structural architecture of the cosmos. After the final thermal flash of the heat death, the universe is exclusively populated by these timeless particles. There is absolutely no baryonic matter left, no cooling white dwarfs, no dead planets, and no biological observers to act as a physical clock. The entire universe is strictly composed of drifting energy that fundamentally ignores the flow of time and physically recognizes a spatial distance of exactly zero. If every single remaining occupant of the cosmos is entirely blind to the concepts of space and time, those dimensions simply cease to function as active physical properties. The universe officially loses its mechanical ability to measure its own physical scale. To comprehend a physical distance like the 93 million miles between a rocky planet and its star, the universe strictly requires solid mass to act as a definitive anchor at both ends. Mass provides the rigid structure necessary to build a physical ruler. By completely destroying the last remaining fraction of structural mass, the evaporating black holes inadvertently incinerated the only ruler the universe possessed. Human intuition dictates that a dead cosmos expanding relentlessly outward must eventually become infinitely large. But without massive particles to provide a structural reference point, the universe has absolutely no mechanical way to distinguish between an infinitely vast, freezing void and a completely microscopic, infinitely dense point. The physical boundary between maximum geometric expansion and absolute geometric collapse is entirely erased. This profound structural amnesia sets the stage for the most radical mathematical framework in modern astrophysics, a strict geometric equation where the frozen, timeless death of our cosmos flawlessly mirrors the fiery, chaotic birth of an entirely new reality. To comprehend the absolute physical size of any structure in the cosmos, the human mind strictly requires a baseline for comparison. We understand the staggering volume of a gas giant like Jupiter only by mentally placing the small rocky sphere of the Earth directly next to it. We define the vast width of a spiral galaxy by measuring it against the microscopic pinpoint of a single burning star. In the rigid framework of classical mechanics, this physical comparison is not just a psychological convenience, it is a strict mathematical requirement. The concept of scale fundamentally does not exist in isolation. Consider a theoretical universe completely empty of all physical matter, containing only a single perfectly smooth three-dimensional triangle. Without a secondary object in that empty void to act as a physical reference point, it is mathematically impossible to determine if that triangle is the size of a microscopic atom or the size of a galactic supercluster. If you were to magically double the physical size of the triangle overnight, absolutely nothing would change mechanically. Because there is no external ruler to measure the expansion, the geometric concept of physical size becomes completely undefined. The shape exists, but its scale is a mathematical phantom. This is the precise structural dilemma the universe faces at the absolute end of the heat death. In the equations of Albert Einstein's general relativity, the physical shape and scale of the cosmos are strictly dictated by the gravitational curvature generated by heavy mass. Massive objects bend the spatial grid, creating a measurable, uneven topography. When the final supermassive black hole completely evaporated, it permanently deleted the last remaining fraction of baryonic mass. The universe was instantly reduced to a pristine, featureless void, where the equations of gravity simply have nothing left to calculate. The cosmos is now a freezing, infinitely expanding ocean of massless radiation. But because every single photon within this void lacks the physical mass required to establish a structural baseline, the universe is suddenly struck by a profound geometric blindness. It no longer possesses the mechanical ability to recognize its own physical scale. Sir Roger Penrose, a British mathematical physicist, recognized that this structural blindness is not merely a theoretical curiosity. It represents a severe vulnerability in the fundamental fabric of reality. If the universe completely forgets how large it physically is, the strict mathematical boundary separating the concept of infinitely large from infinitely small violently collapses. To exploit this vulnerability, astrophysicists must abandon standard dimensional measurements and utilize a highly specialized branch of mathematics, a framework that completely ignores physical size and focuses exclusively on the angles and shapes of reality. By forcing the dead, frozen universe through this specific geometric lens, the boundless vacuum of the heat death mathematically morphs into a microscopic structure that humanity has been desperately attempting to decode for nearly a century. In the microscopic realm of quantum mechanics, a physical ruler is not constructed from rigid elements like steel or titanium. It is fundamentally built from the physical property of mass. In 1923, American physicist Arthur Compton provided the mathematical framework proving that subatomic particles interact with light based on their strict geometric boundaries. According to the foundational equations of quantum field theory, the resting mass of a particle directly dictates the frequency of its internal quantum vibration. This intrinsic vibration acts as a microscopic metronome. Every massive particle in the cosmos, such as an electron or a proton, is mathematically assigned a highly specific quantum wavelength. Because the mass of an electron is a permanent, unchanging value, its corresponding wavelength provides a rigid, immutable yardstick. It provides the cosmos with a precise mechanical tick, allowing the universe to measure the exact distance between two coordinates in space and the chronological gap between two physical events. These massive particles operate as the structural anchors of reality. By populating the universe with glowing stars, rocky planets, and biological observers, the cosmos successfully wove a dense, invisible grid of these microscopic rulers. This grid permanently locked the fabric of space and time into a strict, measurable scale. But when a particle possesses absolutely no mass, it cannot generate a rigid quantum footprint. A photon of light is completely untethered from this geometric restriction. The final evaporation of the last supermassive black hole executed the ultimate cosmic deletion, as the phantom membrane collapsed and detonated into a brief flash of gamma radiation. The universe forcefully converted the last surviving fraction of structured mass into scattered, massless thermal energy. The universe did not simply transition into total darkness, it actively destroyed its own measuring apparatus. By systematically purging every single massive particle from existence, the universe completely dissolved the structural grid. The cosmic ruler was permanently erased. Without mass to anchor the spatial dimensions, the fundamental rigidity of space-time completely evaporates. The cosmos is now entirely populated by massless radiation, drifting through a vacuum that physically cannot distinguish between a spatial distance of 1 millimeter and a vast, empty expanse spanning 1 trillion light-years. This represents a complete mechanical breakdown of standard cosmology. The universe has successfully lost the physical ability to regulate its own geometric volume. Yet, where classical mechanics identifies a fatal structural collapse, theoretical mathematics recognizes an unprecedented opportunity if the universe completely forgets its own physical scale. The vast, freezing expanse of the terminal void becomes highly elastic. It mathematically primes the cosmos for a radical geometric transformation, allowing an infinitely large vacuum to flawlessly mimic the exact physical conditions of a microscopic singularity. Standard Euclidean geometry is strictly obsessed with measuring the physical distance between rigid coordinates. But the mathematical world possesses an entirely different framework, designed specifically to analyze complex shapes, while completely ignoring their physical size. This specialized discipline is known as conformal geometry. To visualize this mathematical framework, imagine projecting a beam of light through a microscopic photographic slide onto a blank wall. If the wall is positioned exactly 1 foot away, the projected image appears small and tightly concentrated. If you move the wall 1 mile away, the image expands into a towering architectural mural. The physical scale of the image drastically changed, but the internal structural angles defining the picture remained flawlessly identical. Conformal geometry cares exclusively about the preservation of angles. It strictly treats the microscopic projection and the massive mural as the exact same mathematical entity. Sir Roger Penrose applied this precise geometric discipline to the absolute end of the cosmos. Because the universe permanently erased its structural ruler during the final evaporation of the supermassive black holes, its physical size is no longer a fixed mathematical variable. This granted Penrose the mechanical permission to apply a conformal rescaling. Without violating a single law of thermodynamics, he utilized conformal mathematics to aggressively compress the infinitely expanding, infinitely cold vacuum of the terminal heat death. He mathematically squashed a limitless eternity down into a definitive geometric boundary. Then, he turned his mathematical lens to the exact opposite coordinate in the cosmic timeline, the absolute beginning of reality. At the precise fraction of a second, the Big Bang ignited. The universe was a microscopic, infinitely dense furnace. But crucially, the ambient temperature was so violently extreme that the Higgs field, the quantum mechanism responsible for granting particles their physical mass, could not functionally operate. In its absolute infancy, the universe was also completely massless. It lacked a physical ruler, just like the terminal void. Because the Big Bang fundamentally lacked a rigid scale, Penrose applied a conformal expansion mathematically stretching the microscopic singularity outward, when the theoretical compression of the infinite future was laid directly on top of the theoretical expansion of the violent past. The equations locked together with terrifying perfection, the conformal geometry of an infinitely large freezing, massless vacuum is mathematically indistinguishable from the conformal geometry of a microscopic, superheated, massless singularity. The two temporal extremes are exactly the same physical state. Penrose successfully proved that the absolute end of our universe mathematically possesses the exact structural architecture required to serve as the primordial singularity for an entirely new reality. The chronological timeline of the cosmos is not a straight line terminating in an eternal graveyard. It is a closed geometric loop, but discovering this mathematical bridge immediately demands a physical trigger. If the freezing void is structurally prepared to become a fiery singularity, what exact mechanical event physically strikes the match? The boundary separating the ultimate death of our cosmos from the fiery birth of the next is not a physical wall. It is an inevitable mathematical phase transition. To visualize this crossover, theoretical physicists utilize a highly specialized map known as a Penrose diagram. Unlike a standard astronomical chart that tracks the physical distance between burning galaxies, a Penrose diagram is strictly designed to capture the absolute totality of space and time within a finite geometric block. On this map, the final heat death of the universe, an eternally expanding, freezing vacuum completely devoid of physical mass, is forcefully compressed into a single flat horizontal line marking the absolute ceiling of the future. Conversely, the explosive ignition of a Big Bang is mathematically drawn as a flat horizontal line representing the absolute floor of the past. Through the strict application of conformal geometry, Sir Roger Penrose demonstrated that these two lines are not parallel boundaries separated by an endless void. The top line of a dying, massless universe flawlessly interlocks with the bottom line of a newly born, massless singularity. They are the exact same mathematical coordinate. The infinite future of a dead cosmos acts as the literal foundation for a new cosmic genesis. This theoretical bridge completely eliminates the necessity for a supernatural beginning. It relies exclusively on the rigid mechanics of scale. When the final event horizon evaporates and the universe officially loses its physical ruler, the scattered thermal radiation does not simply disappear. The total energy of those surviving photons remains completely intact. But because the cosmos can no longer distinguish between an infinitely vast expanse and a microscopic point, the mathematical equations governing the universe experience a sudden, radical reinterpretation. The infinite freezing vacuum is instantly recognized by the laws of physics as a microscopic point of extreme concentrated energy. The sheer volume of massless radiation left over from the death of the previous universe instantly becomes the superheated, tightly packed plasma of a brand new reality. The phase transition is instantaneous and geometrically flawless. The freezing dark aggressively reignites without requiring a single injection of outside energy. This seamless crossover fundamentally shatters the classical narrative of a singular creation event. Our universe is no longer an isolated phenomenon, but merely a temporary physical manifestation in a continuous geometric chain. However, if the architecture of reality operates as a perpetual repeating sequence of cosmic deaths and rebirths, we are forced to redefine the scope of cosmic history itself. We must determine exactly how theoretical physicists mathematically classify these distinct individual periods of existence, and whether the current universe we inhabit is merely a brief echo of a vastly older cycle. When humanity measures the age of the universe, we confidently state that reality is strictly 13.8 billion years old. This measurement is derived by calculating the expansion rate of the cosmos and tracing the trajectories of ancient galaxies backward to a singular microscopic origin. Classical astrophysics treats this timeline as the absolute totality of existence. Sir Roger Penrose's conformal framework demands a radical revision of this cosmic boundary. If the ultimate thermodynamic death of one universe mathematically serves as the primordial genesis for another, the Big Bang can no longer be classified as the absolute beginning of time. It is merely a localized milestone. To accurately map this continuous repeating architecture, theoretical physics required a new categorical definition. Penrose adopted the term aeon. In the framework of conformal cyclic cosmology, an aeon represents one complete individual cycle of existence. Our current reality, encompassing the explosive birth of the cosmos, the ongoing luminous era of fusion-burning stars, and the eventual freezing evaporation of the final supermassive black holes, constitutes exactly one aeon. It is a single self-contained sequence with a definitive beginning and a definitive mathematical end. But it is not the only sequence. The mathematical bridge dictates that our current aeon is physically preceded by a completely distinct older universe. That previous aeon possessed its own timeline, its own expanding galaxies, and its own terminal heat death. When that older universe completely erased its physical mass, its freezing vacuum mathematically transitioned into the superheated plasma that ignited our specific Big Bang. Consequently, when our current aeon finally exhausts its thermodynamic fuel and collapses into a massless, timeless void, it will seamlessly transition into the primordial singularity of a brand new subsequent aeon. The architecture of reality is constructed from an infinite, unbroken chain of these consecutive cycles. We are not inhabiting the one and only universe. We are simply transient observers residing strictly within the current aeon, occupying a microscopic slice of a mechanical sequence that extends infinitely into the past and infinitely into the unwritten future. This theoretical sequence successfully removes the requirement for a supernatural creation event. The universe does not need to be sparked from absolute nothingness, because absolute nothingness fundamentally does not exist. There is only an endless succession of aeons continuously feeding into one another. Yet claiming that a freezing dead vacuum flawlessly morphs into a violently hot singularity requires more than just a geometric alignment. To validate this perpetual cosmic engine, physicists must identify the exact thermodynamic mechanism that physically detonates the next Big Bang without requiring a single injection of outside energy. Temperature is strictly a measure of density. To comprehend the mechanical ignition of a new cosmic cycle, we must understand how physical heat operates within an enclosed space. Imagine a vast terrestrial warehouse heated by a single burning candle. Because the microscopic thermal energy is stretched across a massive architectural volume, the overall ambient temperature remains freezing. But if you were to mathematically shrink the external walls of the warehouse down to the size of a thimble while keeping the exact same candle burning safely inside, the enclosed space would instantly become a violent inferno. The thermodynamic energy of the flame never increased, only the geometric volume surrounding it collapsed. This exact structural manipulation drives the perpetual engine of the cosmos. At the absolute terminal end of a cosmic cycle, the universe contains a staggering, fixed amount of thermodynamic energy. This energy exists exclusively in the form of scattered photons and the decaying radiation from ancient black holes. Because this light is entirely dispersed across an infinitely expanding vacuum, the overall temperature of a reality mathematically flatlines just above absolute zero. The universe operates as a freezing graveyard. But when the final massive particle decays and the physical ruler of space is permanently erased, the laws of conformal geometry forcibly intervene The infinite volume of the dead cosmos is aggressively rescaled. The boundless freezing vacuum is mathematically crushed down into a microscopic geometric coordinate. The universe does not receive a miraculous injection of fresh energy from an outside source. It strictly recycles the scattered thermodynamic waste of the dead aeon by violently compressing the surviving radiation of a vast cosmos into an infinitely small singularity. The energy density mathematically skyrockets. The freezing vacuum instantaneously becomes an unimaginably hot, tightly packed plasma. This extreme spike in thermal density provides the exact physical conditions required to ignite a brand new Big Bang. The absolute thermodynamic death of the previous universe serves as the literal mechanical spark for the next. Sir Roger Penrose designed a mathematical framework that successfully explains the flawless genesis of our reality without violating a single law of physics. The cosmos is a completely self-sustaining engine. However, claiming that our current reality was forged directly from the ashes of a deceased universe demands strict observational proof. If a previous aeon truly existed, and its supermassive black holes violently evaporated into the void before igniting our specific Big Bang, that catastrophic transition could not have been perfectly clean. A violent physical transition always leaves a structural scar. To prove that this cyclical theory is an actual physical reality and not merely a geometric illusion, human astrophysicists must look deep into the primordial background of our own expanding sky and hunt for the gravitational ghosts of a dead universe. In 1964, two radio astronomers in New Jersey stumbled upon a persistent, agonizing hum emanating from their massive microwave antenna. Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson aggressively scrubbed their equipment, physically removing a nesting colony of pigeons in a desperate attempt to silence the static. The microscopic interference stubbornly remained. It was completely uniform, raining down on the terrestrial surface from absolutely every coordinate in the open sky. They had inadvertently captured the oldest physical photograph in existence. They had detected the cosmic microwave background. To comprehend the sheer geometric scale of this discovery, we must wind the timeline of reality completely backward. For the first 380,000 years following the fiery ignition of the Big Bang, the cosmos was utterly blind. The rapidly expanding universe was a violently turbulent, opaque furnace of superheated plasma. The spatial density of free-floating electrons was so incredibly severe that photons of light were forcefully absorbed the precise moment they were generated. Light fundamentally could not travel. The infant universe was a suffocating, blinding fog. But as the spatial grid relentlessly expanded, the ambient temperature of the primordial plasma eventually dropped. The chaotic electrons aggressively decelerated, allowing them to strictly bond with protons to forge the very first hydrogen atoms. This absolute mechanical transition is universally known in astrophysics as recombination. By physically removing the dense swarm of free electrons from the void, the opaque fog instantly cleared. For the first time in the history of our aeon, light was permitted to travel forward in a straight geometric line. This initial burst of liberated light, the foundational thermal glow of a newborn reality, has been drifting across the expanding void ever since. Over 13 billion years, this ancient light has been severely stretched by the expansion of space, cooling into the faint microwave static that Penzias and Wilson accidentally recorded. The cosmic microwave background operates as the absolute visual boundary of reality. It is a rigid spherical wall of thermal radiation completely enclosing the observable universe. Because no physical light could travel prior to the event of recombination, human astrophysics mathematically cannot see past this primordial wall. But for Sir Roger Penrose, this ancient static provided the ultimate diagnostic canvas. If our specific Big Bang was truly ignited by the violent geometric compression of a dead previous universe, the catastrophic energy from that mathematical crossover would not have simply vanished. The immense thermodynamic shockwaves bleeding over from the prior aeon would have violently smashed directly into the nascent plasma of our own reality. This cosmic collision would have permanently branded the cosmic microwave background with localized, highly unnatural temperature variations. The scars of a deceased universe are mathematically required to be physically imprinted directly onto the thermal wall of our own creation. Yet, claiming that ancient damage exists on a microscopic map of static immediately poses a brutal diagnostic dilemma. How can human instruments accurately distinguish the violent, structural ghost of a dead universe from the chaotic, completely natural thermal noise of our own primordial fire? The standard model of cosmology demands that the primordial thermal wall is fundamentally smooth. According to the theory of cosmic inflation, in the absolute fraction of a second following the Big Bang, the spatial grid of the universe expanded at an incomprehensible exponential rate. This violent outward push aggressively stretched the newborn cosmos, forcefully ironing out any massive structural irregularities. The resulting plasma was left flawlessly uniform. The only variations permitted by mainstream inflation are microscopic, completely randomized temperature fluctuations born strictly from quantum mechanics. If the universe truly ignited from absolute nothingness, the static of the cosmic microwave background must represent perfect, random noise. But Sir Roger Penrose recognized that a cyclical universe violently breaks this rule. If our reality was forged directly from the thermodynamic death of a previous aeon, the primordial plasma would not be a pristine blank slate. The geometric crossover between two consecutive universes operates as a severe mathematical filter. Solid baryonic matter is permanently deleted. Structural gravity is completely erased, but pure massless radiation flawlessly survives the transition. If a localized region in the previous universe possessed an incredibly concentrated, astronomical amount of thermodynamic energy right before the final heat death, that specific energy cluster would successfully bleed through the mathematical bridge. It would aggressively punch through the boundary of the crossover and violently impact the opaque plasma of our newborn universe. This primordial collision would permanently brand the cosmic microwave background with a distinct structural scar. We are not hunting for scattered, randomized thermal debris. The mathematics dictate that these scars must manifest as highly specific, non-random geometric anomalies. They would appear as localized, intensely concentrated spots of heat, burning significantly hotter than the surrounding ambient static. To locate these ancient impact craters, astrophysicists utilized the staggering observational power of the Planck satellite. They stripped away the blinding localized radiation of our own Milky Way galaxy and stared directly at the faint 13 billion-year-old thermal boundary. They applied aggressive mathematical filters to the raw data, hunting exclusively for geometric patterns that defied the strict, randomized laws of standard cosmic inflation. This diagnostic search was an exercise in extreme cosmic archaeology. Human instruments were attempting to peer directly through the opaque wall of the Big Bang to detect the localized ghosts of a dead reality. When the raw data was finally processed, the thermal map revealed a deeply unsettling structural anomaly. The faint static of the early universe was not perfectly random, scattered across the primordial sky. Physicists identified distinct, highly concentrated coordinates of extreme thermal radiation. These unnatural hotspots forcefully defied standard cosmological predictions, providing the first potential physical footprint of a deceased universe. The anomalous hotspots scattered across the primordial map of the cosmic microwave background required a definitive mechanical origin. Sir Roger Penrose identified these concentrated geometric scars as the absolute final thermodynamic footprints of the previous aeon. He officially classified them as Hawking points. To comprehend how a ghost from a dead universe physically brands our sky, we must track the chronological life cycle of a supermassive black hole in the previous reality. Throughout its active existence, the giant aggressively consumed surrounding galaxies, crushing billions of solar masses into an infinitely dense singularity. But as the previous aeon relentlessly expanded and entered its terminal heat death, the black hole was left completely isolated in a freezing, empty vacuum. It slowly bled its immense physical mass back into the dark void exclusively through the microscopic leak of Hawking radiation. This excruciatingly slow thermodynamic evaporation requires 10 to the power of 100 years to completely finish. By the time the black hole violently detonated into its final thermal flash, its lifetime of emitted radiation had slowly expanded into a staggering, unimaginably vast sphere of pure energy drifting through the dead cosmos. But the mathematical crossover between the two consecutive universes completely destroys physical scale. When the boundless, massless vacuum of the dead aeon was geometrically crushed into the microscopic singularity of our own Big Bang, that staggeringly huge sphere of trapped Hawking radiation experienced an extreme mathematical collapse. The infinite expanse of scattered thermal energy, representing the total evaporated mass of billions of ancient stars, was instantly condensed down into a single, superheated microscopic coordinate. When our specific universe rapidly ignited and expanded, that highly concentrated dot of recycled energy violently smashed into our opaque primordial plasma. The impact left a permanent, localized burn mark on the fundamental wall of the cosmic microwave background. Penrose named these anomalies to honor Stephen Hawking, the theoretical physicist who first proved that black holes are strictly finite. A Hawking point is literally the concentrated ash of a deceased supermassive giant from a universe that no longer exists. Yet, the slow thermodynamic evaporation of an isolated black hole is a relatively quiet death. If a solitary giant can successfully punch a concentrated dot of heat through the opaque wall of the Big Bang, we are forced to consider the most violent macroscopic events in the cosmos. What physical scar is left behind when two supermassive giants violently collide and merge in the dying days of the previous reality? A cataclysmic gravitational collision of that magnitude would not merely leave a localized point of heat, it would send massive, unyielding geometric ripples crashing directly through the mathematical boundary of eternity. Deep within the luminous era of the previous ion, the architectural stability of entire galactic superclusters was ruthlessly anchored by supermassive black holes. These gravitational titans commanded the orbital trajectories of billions of fusion-burning stars. But as the underlying spatial grid relentlessly expanded and neighboring galaxies were forced into brutal cosmic collisions, their central black holes were inevitably dragged into catastrophic orbital dances. When two supermassive giants become gravitationally locked, they initiate a terrifying death spiral. For tens of millions of years, they violently whip around one another, relentlessly bleeding their combined orbital energy out into the surrounding void. As the physical distance between the two phantom event horizons severely contracts, the sheer velocity of the giants aggressively accelerates toward the absolute speed limit of causality. The three-dimensional spatial grid trapped between them is severely stretched and brutally twisted. In the ultimate fraction of a second, the two absolute voids violently smash together, permanently merging their masses into a singular, infinitely denser geometry. This localized merger represents the single most mechanically violent, macroscopic event strictly permitted by the foundational equations of relativity. The raw kinetic energy released during the exact moment of impact drastically eclipses the combined luminous output of every single burning star scattered across the observable cosmos. Yet this apocalyptic detonation is completely invisible to the electromagnetic spectrum. It does not generate a single photon of light. The staggering energy is exclusively converted into raw, unyielding structural distortion. The collision detonates as a massive tsunami of gravitational waves. Unlike thermal radiation or superheated plasma, a gravitational wave does not mechanically interact with standard physical matter. It is a pure, frictionless ripple violently expanding directly through the foundational fabric of space and time. As the older aeon relentlessly decayed and ultimately plunged into its freezing, terminal heat death, these colossal geometric ripples continued to expand aggressively outward, remaining entirely unaffected by the dropping temperature of the dying void. They operate as the ultimate mechanical survivors. When the dead universe finally exhausted its ultimate thermodynamic fuel and completely erased its physical ruler, the cosmos was mathematically forced through the conformal crossover into our specific reality. To successfully penetrate this geometric boundary, a physical entity must fundamentally lack structural mass. Baryonic matter is permanently destroyed. The localized gravity anchoring heavy objects is strictly dissolved, but a gravitational wave fundamentally possesses absolutely zero rest mass. It is nothing more than a pure geometric fluctuation, mechanically locked at exactly 186,000 miles per second. This precise mathematical classification grants the violent ripple an unprecedented level of physical immunity. It guarantees that the apocalyptic shockwave from a deceased reality is structurally permitted to survive the absolute death of its own universe, setting a catastrophic collision course directly with the primordial plasma of our newborn Big Bang. A physical barricade cannot stop a wave that fundamentally ignores physical structure. When the previous aeon finally exhausted its thermodynamic fuel and completely dissolved its physical ruler, the mathematical boundary of the conformal crossover acted as an absolute cosmic filter. Any particle possessing even a microscopic fraction of rest mass was permanently halted and deleted. The crossover strictly requires its passengers to be completely massless and mechanically locked at exactly 186,000 miles per second. Because a gravitational wave perfectly fulfills both of these severe geometric requirements, it effortlessly bypassed the quarantine. But the geometric scale of a gravitational wave is drastically different from the concentrated thermal footprint of an evaporating black hole. A Hawking point originates from a localized sphere of trapped radiation that mathematically collapses into a single microscopic dot. A gravitational wave generated by the violent merger of two supermassive giants operates as a relentlessly expanding cosmic tsunami. By the time the older universe officially died, this invisible ripple had aggressively stretched across billions of light-years of empty space. When this colossal, expanding wave mathematically crossed the boundary and violently smashed directly into the fiery ignition of our specific Big Bang, it did not manifest as a localized, microscopic pinpoint of heat. It struck the newborn reality as an immense, perfectly spherical shockwave. The sheer mechanical force of the ancient ripple violently shoved the superheated, dense plasma of our infant universe. It aggressively compressed the primordial matter, acting as an invisible cosmic snowplow forcefully dragging through a dense fog. This massive kinetic impact permanently branded the fundamental wall of our reality with a vastly different structural scar. Instead of leaving a microscopic dot, the ancient gravitational wave forcefully imprinted a colossal circular disturbance directly onto the thermal map of the cosmic microwave background. Because supermassive black holes in the previous aeon often collided in repeating sequences as galactic superclusters relentlessly cannibalized one another. These gravitational shockwaves were frequently fired in consecutive, overlapping bursts. The ancient ripples crossed the mathematical boundary in a rhythmic sequence, striking our newborn plasma one after another like massive stones violently thrown into a perfectly still pond. This mechanical process guarantees that the thermal ghosts of the previous universe are not merely scattered, chaotic bruises. The mathematics dictate that they must manifest as massive, highly organized geometric patterns permanently burned into our primordial sky. But mathematically predicting an apocalyptic ring of heat is entirely different from physically locating one. To successfully validate the conformal cyclic cosmology framework, astrophysicists were forced to deeply analyze the freezing static of the early cosmos and aggressively hunt for an impossible configuration of perfect. Repeating circles, staring at the static of the early universe, is an exercise in extreme mathematical filtering. To validate the geometric existence of a previous ion, Sir Roger Penrose and his colleague Vahe Gurzadian analyzed the raw microwave data captured by the Wilkinson Microwave Anisotropy Probe, and later the Advanced Planck satellite. They were not merely hunting for localized dots of heat. They were aggressively searching for regions in the deep sky where the temperature variance completely flatlines in a strict circular pattern. When an ancient gravitational wave forcefully pushes through the primordial plasma of our newborn cosmos, it mechanically sweeps matter outward. This massive kinetic displacement creates a perfectly circular ridge of slightly altered temperature. Because the supermassive giants of the previous universe frequently merged in repeating binary sequences, these immense impacts should theoretically generate concentric circles. They would manifest as rings flawlessly nested inside of other rings, physically resembling a massive target painted directly onto the thermal wall of reality. By aggressively stripping away the blinding radiation of our local Milky Way and running thousands of simulated control maps, the mathematical analysis exposed a profound geometric anomaly. The actual primordial sky contains definitive sets of perfectly concentric rings possessing an unnaturally low variance in temperature. The physical scale of these geometric scars is staggering. A single set of these nested rings stretches across a diameter of space so vast that it could comfortably swallow thousands of modern galactic superclusters. Mainstream cosmologists immediately challenged this observation. They strictly argued that these massive rings are merely statistical illusions, randomly generated by the chaotic quantum noise of standard cosmic inflation. But the sheer structural depth and flawless repetition of the nested patterns stubbornly defy standard, random probability. The conformal framework suggests that we are looking directly at the structural blast radius of a reality that died long before our physical time began. However, this massive structural survival creates a severe thermodynamic contradiction. If the intense geometric chaos and scattered radiation of the previous universe successfully crossed the mathematical bridge, a fundamental physical ledger was violently breached. If the absolute chaos of the previous aeon bled directly into our reality, how did our specific Big Bang mechanically manage to begin its existence in a state of perfectly pristine, low-entropy order? The second law of thermodynamics strictly dictates that the total chaos of an isolated system must relentlessly increase. By the time a universe reaches its terminal heat death, it should mathematically possess an astronomical, unmanageable amount of entropy. If this immense chaotic ledger is dragged directly across the conformal bridge into the next aeon, our specific Big Bang would have ignited as a violently disordered wasteland. It would have possessed absolutely no thermodynamic gradient to forge galaxies or biological life. Yet the observable reality proves our cosmos began in a state of immaculate, incredibly low entropy order. To resolve this severe mechanical paradox, we must completely redefine exactly where the universe physically stores its chaos. Human intuition assumes that a violently scattered cloud of thermal radiation represents the absolute maximum state of cosmic disorder. But in the grand architectural scale of reality, scattered light contributes a mathematically insignificant fraction of the total entropy. The vast overwhelming majority of all chaos in the cosmos is strictly generated and hoarded by extreme gravity. Throughout the active lifespan of a universe, supermassive black holes operate as the ultimate thermodynamic vaults as they relentlessly swallow billions of fusion-burning stars and drag neighboring galaxies into their event horizons. They ruthlessly crush structured matter into an infinitely dense singularity. This catastrophic gravitational collapse creates an incomprehensible spike in localized entropy. By the time the older Aeon entered its dying epoch, practically all of its thermodynamic chaos was securely locked entirely behind the invisible membranes of these supermassive giants. This localized hoarding provides the exact mechanical solution to the cosmic reset. When an isolated black hole spends 10 to the power of 100 years slowly bleeding its mass into the freezing vacuum through Hawking radiation, it is not merely leaking physical energy. It is aggressively dismantling the gravitational well itself as the phantom membrane violently shrinks and ultimately detonates into its final thermal flash. The physical concept of macroscopic gravity is permanently erased from that specific coordinate. The thermal radiation left behind by the evaporation is structurally smooth and perfectly uniform. The staggering gravitational chaos that was trapped inside the giant does not simply spill out into the empty void. Because the fundamental degrees of freedom associated with extreme gravitational curvature are physically destroyed, the chaos is mathematically deleted from the thermodynamic ledger by systematically evaporating every single supermassive black hole in existence. The dying universe executes a brutal, universe-wide purge of its own gravitational entropy. The cosmos systematically deletes its own chaos. But completely scrubbing the thermodynamic ledger requires more than just destroying the black holes. The universe must fundamentally guarantee that the chaotic force of gravity itself cannot physically interfere with the fiery ignition of the next reality. The mathematical bridge connecting two distinct universes strictly requires a flawless physical filter. While massless radiation and ancient gravitational shockwaves are permitted to cross the geometric boundary, the active structural force of gravity itself must be completely neutralized. To explain this absolute mechanical necessity, Sir Roger Penrose introduced a strict theoretical framework known as the Weyl curvature hypothesis. In the foundational equations of general relativity, the physical warping of spacetime is divided into distinct mathematical components. The specific component responsible for tidal gravity, the severe uneven gravitational pull that violently stretches and rips a physical object as it approaches a black hole, is mathematically measured by the Weyl curvature tensor. Throughout the active lifespan of a universe, as massive galactic superclusters violently collide and supermassive giants ruthlessly crush matter, the Weyl curvature aggressively spikes. The structural fabric of space becomes severely tangled, creating a violently chaotic topography. This severe geometric distortion is the literal physical manifestation of macroscopic entropy. If this immense distortion were allowed to cross into a new universe, the Big Bang would not produce a smooth, uniform expansion. It would violently vomit chaotic, fragmented singularities directly into the void. But the absolute terminal phase of the dying Aeon systematically dismantles this threat by agonizingly evaporating the final supermassive black holes and systematically destroying every single fundamental particle possessing physical mass. The dying universe violently removes the structural anchors required to bend the spatial grid. Without physical mass to actively twist the fabric of reality, the tidal gravitational forces completely evaporate. The tangled, distorted topography of spacetime relentlessly relaxes. As the dead, massless universe is mathematically pushed directly through the conformal crossover, the Weyl curvature is forcibly crushed down to exactly zero. The mathematical equations completely iron out the structural wrinkles of reality. The underlying fabric of space successfully transitions from a violently chaotic, tangled mess into a perfectly flat, flawlessly smooth geometric sheet. This absolute flattening effectively wipes the thermodynamic ledger completely clean. The immense gravitational chaos that aggressively accumulated over 10 to the power of 100 years of brutal cosmic history is fundamentally deleted from the architecture of reality. This pristine geometric state guarantees that the superheated plasma of the newly born universe inherits absolutely zero structural distortion from the deceased reality. The newborn cosmos is mechanically granted a flawless, highly organized reboot. But if the fundamental slate is completely wiped clean and gravity is strictly zeroed out at the exact moment of primordial creation, we are forced to address the ultimate structural dilemma of our own existence. How does a perfectly smooth, zero-gravity plasma field successfully transition into a universe dominated by heavy, complex gravitational structures? At the exact fraction of a second following the explosive ignition of our reality, the fundamental force of gravity was completely paralyzed. To comprehend the primordial engine of the Big Bang, we must invert our classical understanding of thermodynamic chaos. In a standard terrestrial environment, such as a sealed container of gas, a perfectly uniform distribution of molecules represents absolute maximum entropy. It is the ultimate state of disorder. But when calculating the cosmic ledger of a universe strictly dominated by general relativity, the thermodynamic rules aggressively flip. For the architectural force of gravity, perfectly smooth uniformity is the ultimate definition of pristine, low-entropy order. Gravity fundamentally desires to crush matter together. It relentlessly seeks to build chaotic, dense structures like collapsing stars and supermassive black holes. Therefore, a perfectly smooth, uniform spatial grid is a blank thermodynamic canvas. It possesses the maximum possible potential to perform mechanical work. When the dead massless vacuum of the previous aeon was mathematically forced through the conformal crossover, it violently ignited into a superheated, infinitely dense plasma. But crucially, the ambient temperature of this newborn reality was so violently extreme that the fundamental particles strictly could not interact with the Higgs field. They possessed absolutely no rest mass. Without physical mass to act as a structural anchor, gravity had absolutely nothing to pull against. The primordial universe was allowed to relentlessly expand outward without facing a single microscopic fraction of gravitational resistance. This temporary suspension of structural gravity guaranteed that the rapidly expanding plasma remained flawlessly uniform. The catastrophic cosmic reset was complete. The mathematical deletion of the Weyl curvature in the dying days of the previous aeon successfully granted our newborn Big Bang a pristine, perfectly ordered thermodynamic ledger. The arrow of time was officially provided with a fresh, unbroken structural gradient to march forward. But this perfect geometric tranquility is strictly temporary. As the spatial grid aggressively expands, the ambient temperature of the superheated plasma relentlessly plunges at a highly specific coordinate in cosmic history. The cooling universe fundamentally crosses a thermodynamic threshold. The Higgs field mechanically engages. The chaotic storm of drifting subatomic energy suddenly acquires physical mass, permanently locking the primordial particles into rigid, geometric boundaries. The instant mass is mathematically introduced into the void. The sleeping force of gravity violently awakens. The perfect uniformity of the early cosmos is immediately compromised. The freshly anchored particles begin to severely pull on one another, aggressively clumping together to forge the very first primordial hydrogen clouds. The immaculate low-entropy slate is permanently shattered as the universe takes its first relentless steps toward a brand new terminal: heat death. This structural awakening completes the localized mechanical cycle. But to truly comprehend the staggering architectural scale of Sir Roger Penrose's framework, we must forcefully zoom out from our own localized genesis and confront the terrifying infinite chain of eternity. The human mind is biologically hardwired to demand a definitive origin story. We inherently assume that every physical process must possess a strictly defined starting line and a permanent conclusion. But when we apply this localized biological intuition to the foundational architecture of conformal cyclic cosmology, the mathematical framework completely rejects the premise. In the strict geometry of this cyclic reality, there is absolutely no concept of a first Big Bang. There is no primordial spark that mysteriously ignited the very first aeon out of absolute nothingness. The mathematical equations governing the conformal crossover do not contain a numerical limit. They do not degrade, they do not rust, and they do fundamentally not lose physical momentum after a set number of repeating cosmic cycles. The engine of reality requires no external maintenance. When astrophysicists analyze the violent thermal scars branded across our primordial sky, they are not looking at the remnants of the original universe. The deceased reality that directly preceded our own Big Bang was itself forged from the freezing ashes of an even older cosmos. This mechanical regression extends infinitely backward into a chronological past that possesses absolutely no geometric boundary. The sequence extends with equal, unyielding violence into the unwritten future. When our current universe finally exhausts its thermodynamic fuel, evaporates its final supermassive black hole, and successfully zeroes out its macroscopic gravitational entropy, it will strictly not achieve a permanent state of rest. Our freezing terminal void will be forcefully compressed to spark the fiery ignition of an entirely new reality. That subsequent cosmos will eventually be populated by its own expanding galaxies, its own fusion-burning stars, and its own temporary localized observers. We are currently inhabiting an arbitrary, fundamentally unnumbered link in an eternal, unbreakable mechanical chain. This infinite repetition successfully eliminates the need for a miraculous cosmic genesis. Reality exists simply because the mathematical laws of geometry aggressively forbid the physical state of absolute nothingness, but this staggering architectural scale immediately introduces a terrifying vulnerability regarding the fundamental data of the cosmos. If the physical mass, the structural gravity, and the localized thermodynamic chaos of each universe are aggressively scrubbed clean during every single phase transition, we are forced to question the structural integrity of physical information itself. Do the strict laws of quantum mechanics and relativity survive the apocalyptic reset, or does the universe completely rewrite its own foundational code every time it violently reboots? In classical astrophysics, the permanent destruction of physical information is considered a severe violation of quantum mechanics. When a localized physical object is ruthlessly crushed behind the event horizon of a black hole and subsequently evaporated into randomized thermal radiation, the highly specific structural data defining that object is theoretically lost forever. This localized deletion is a violent, chaotic mechanical process that aggressively scrambles data, but the conformal reset of the entire cosmos operates under a completely different mathematical jurisdiction. The catastrophic phase transition, separating two consecutive ions, aggressively purges physical mass and mathematically zeroes out macroscopic gravity. It violently wipes the thermodynamic slate completely clean. Yet this cosmic purge strictly targets structural chaos and uneven topography. It fundamentally does not delete the foundational source code of reality. The underlying physical laws governing the mechanical behavior of the cosmos are strictly immune to the conformal compression when the freezing massless vacuum of the previous aeon mathematically morphs into the superheated primordial plasma of our specific Big Bang. The foundational constants of nature flawlessly survive the boundary crossing. The absolute speed limit of causality remains strictly locked at exactly 186,000 miles per second. The rigid mathematical ratio defining the exact strength of electromagnetism passes directly through the geometric bridge completely unaltered. The invisible quantum fields responsible for eventually granting particles their physical mass are securely inherited by the newborn reality. The universe relentlessly destroys its physical hardware, but it meticulously preserves its absolute operating system. This strict preservation of fundamental data mathematically guarantees that the subsequent aeon will mechanically function identically to its predecessor. It will predictably expand, it will eventually cool to allow the precise geometric formation of hydrogen atoms, and it will inevitably ignite a brand new, sprawling network of fusion-burning stars. The cosmos is not a randomized casino where the foundational laws of physics are wildly recalculated with every single primordial ignition. It is a highly ordered, perpetual engine operating on a strictly immutable set of geometric blueprints. The universe violently recycles its thermodynamic energy, but its foundational mechanical intelligence is utterly eternal. This flawless inheritance of cosmic data perfectly secures the structural integrity of the infinite chain. Yet when human astrophysics attempts to calculate the sheer temporal magnitude required to execute just one single cycle of this perpetual machine, we are brutally forced to confront the terrifying brevity of the era we currently inhabit. To mathematically comprehend the sheer physical scale of a single cosmic cycle, we must violently strip away our localized biological arrogance. The entirety of recorded human history, spanning from the construction of the first ancient terrestrial monuments to the launch of titanium probes into interstellar space, occupies roughly 10,000 years when measured against the 13.8 billion year age of our current expanding reality. The entire human epoch mathematically registers as a microscopic, practically invisible statistical anomaly. Yet, even the 13.8 billion years of our current universe represents absolutely nothing but the immediate, explosive infancy of the aeon. The cosmos is currently enjoying the stelliferous era, a fiercely active epoch dominated by the furious ignition of fusion-burning stars and the violent collisions of galactic superclusters. But the foundational laws of thermodynamics strictly dictate that this luminous period is a staggeringly brief, temporary flush. In roughly 100 trillion years, the last dying red dwarf star will exhaust its nuclear fuel and permanently plunge the cosmos into absolute, unyielding darkness. When the final star fades, the true chronological lifespan of the aeon officially begins. The dead universe will be entirely dominated by the silent, drifting membranes of supermassive black holes. These gravitational titans will rule the freezing void for an incomprehensible stretch of deep time, requiring a staggering 10 to the power of 100 years just to agonizingly evaporate their mass into scattered thermal radiation. If you were to map the entire chronological lifespan of a single aeon onto a massive physical timeline stretching from the Earth to the Sun, the active, starlight era that currently sustains biological life would not even occupy the width of a single human hair. This is the terrifying geometric reality of Sir Roger Penrose's framework. The staggering, incomprehensible abyss of time required to exhaust a single universe is merely one individual mechanical stroke in an endless, repeating engine. An infinite chain of these cycles stretches infinitely backward and infinitely forward. The cosmos is a perpetual machine operating on a scale that completely dwarfs physical comprehension. The universe does not care about the localized biological entities briefly occupying its expanding grid. We are confined to a microscopic sliver of light in a machine dominated by eternal darkness and extreme mathematical resets. But if the cosmos relentlessly destroys its physical hardware and systematically wipes its own slate completely clean, how is it that the fragile, temporary observers trapped inside this specific aeon possess the strict mechanical ability to peer directly through the Big Bang and successfully decode the violent architecture of eternity? A biological observer is not a localized cosmic anomaly. It is a strict thermodynamic engine to successfully process mathematical information and decode the geometric blueprints of reality. A physical entity fundamentally requires extreme structural complexity. The superheated primordial plasma generated by the explosive ignition of our Big Bang was incredibly dense, but it was fundamentally simplistic. It strictly contained microscopic hydrogen and helium atoms. It completely lacked the heavy, complex atomic architecture required to construct the localized neurological grid of a conscious brain. To physically build an observer, the cosmos was strictly forced to wait for the gravitational ignition of the very first fusion-burning stars. The extreme pressure deep within the cores of these stellar furnaces operated as a relentless cosmic forge. By violently crushing simple atomic structures together, the stars mechanically manufactured heavy elements like carbon, nitrogen, and iron. When these massive stars eventually detonated in catastrophic supernova explosions, they aggressively seeded the expanding spatial grid with the strict physical building blocks of biological life, because these complex elements are exclusively manufactured by the active mechanics of burning stars. Conscious observers are strictly confined to the exact same temporal timeline. Biological life fundamentally cannot exist in the superheated, opaque violence of the primordial Big Bang, and it mathematically cannot survive the freezing, massless eternity of the terminal heat death. The physical existence of an observer is absolutely locked inside the staggeringly brief stelliferous era. Humanity occupies a microscopic, highly specific thermodynamic window where the universe possesses a steep enough energy gradient to temporarily support organized biological complexity. This extreme temporal limitation strictly defines our fundamental mechanical purpose. During the infinite, freezing stretch of the dying void, the cosmos is a blind graveyard, completely devoid of physical rulers. Without massive structures to act as geometric anchors, the universe fundamentally cannot measure its own physical scale or recognize its own chronological timeline. By aggressively constructing complex biological entities during the localized flash of the starlight era, the universe temporarily manufactures its own conscious instruments. For a microscopic fraction of cosmic time, the blind mechanical geometry of reality successfully opens a biological eye. It temporarily utilizes our fragile, carbon-based structures to stare directly backward across the mathematical boundary of the Big Bang, successfully detecting the violent thermal scars of a dead universe and accurately calculating the terrifying scope of its own infinite sequence. However, if human consciousness is merely a temporary instrument engineered to observe the endless loop of cosmic death and rebirth, we must rigorously define the ultimate philosophical weight of our own inevitable extinction. Biological entities are structurally hardwired with a relentless mechanical drive for self-preservation. Human civilization continuously projects its localized legacy into the deep future, obsessing over the permanent survival of our species and the eternal endurance of our architectural monuments. But when viewed through the strictly unemotional lens of conformal cyclic cosmology, the ultimate extinction of all biological life is not a tragic failure. It is a rigid thermodynamic requirement. To successfully execute the mathematical crossover into a brand new aeon, the dying universe must completely empty its physical ledger. It must achieve a pristine state of absolute, massless geometric uniformity. The very heavy atomic elements that make biological consciousness mechanically possible, the carbon in our cellular structures, the iron in our blood, and the calcium in our bones, are constructed strictly from rigid baryonic matter. As long as these massive particles exist, they function as microscopic rulers. They provide the spatial grid with a definitive physical scale and aggressively anchor the topological distortions of macroscopic gravity. If a highly advanced civilization somehow engineered a thermodynamic method to physically survive the terminal heat death, their continued existence would fundamentally break the perpetual cosmic engine by artificially preserving their structural mass in a freezing, expanding void. They would prevent the universe from completely erasing its own ruler. The conformal reset would mathematically fail. The freezing vacuum would be strictly forbidden from geometrically compressing into the superheated primordial plasma of a new Big Bang. The eternal chain of cosmic rebirth would violently stall, permanently locking reality in a stagnant, dead expanse. Therefore, the absolute eradication of biological observers is not a localized cosmic cruelty. It is a fundamental mechanical prerequisite. The universe relentlessly manufactures complex biological life during the brief, energetic flash of the stelliferous era to temporarily observe and calculate its own geometric architecture. But once that localized thermodynamic window inevitably closes, the cosmos must ruthlessly dismantle its own instruments. Every single atom of structural mass we possess must eventually be crushed inside the event horizon of a supermassive black hole, evaporated into randomized thermal radiation, and mathematically scrubbed from the spatial grid. Our inevitable erasure is the exact physical mechanism that successfully clears the primordial canvas. Our extinction is the absolute geometric price demanded by the cosmos to guarantee the explosive ignition of the next reality. This strict mathematical boundary guarantees that we will leave absolutely no physical monuments behind. But if the physical slate is wiped completely clean and no biological data can survive the conformal reset, we must confront the final, overarching reality of our specific existence. How do we define the ultimate meaning of human consciousness when our entire universe is merely a transient, disposable spark in an infinite sequence of eternity? To confront the absolute finality of our specific aeon is to reject the biological instinct for permanence. The eventual evaporation of our physical reality into a cold, massless void is not a thermodynamic tragedy. It is the ultimate expression of cosmic equilibrium. Throughout the staggeringly brief flash of the stelliferous era, the universe successfully manufactured complex atomic structures, ignited billions of fusion-burning stars, and temporarily supported the fragile architecture of conscious observers. We are not merely drifting dust trapped inside a chaotic, randomized explosion. We are the highly specific, temporary instruments the cosmos mathematically required to recognize its own infinite sequence. For a microscopic fraction of eternity, the universe effectively woke up. It utilized our localized biological lenses to stare directly backward across the mathematical boundary of the Big Bang, successfully decoding the gravitational ghosts of a dead reality and accurately calculating the terrifying trajectory of its own future. Our existence, however transient, is a profound mechanical triumph. When the last red dwarf star eventually exhausts its nuclear fuel and the cosmos plunges into unyielding darkness, the universe will officially begin its final thermodynamic purge. The supermassive black holes will relentlessly dominate the freezing void for 10 to the power of 100 years, systematically hoarding and ultimately evaporating the structural chaos of our reality. They will slowly bleed the physical mass of our ion back into the dark, relentlessly zeroing out the macroscopic gravity that anchors the spatial grid. The universe will eventually return to a state of pristine, massless geometric perfection. It will completely forget the physical scale of our terrestrial civilization. It will permanently erase the structural memory of our expanding galaxies and completely dissolve the localized thermodynamic weight of our existence. But that absolute structural amnesia is not the end of the timeline. It is the exact mathematical trigger required to strike the cosmic match. By completely losing its physical ruler, our dead universe will geometrically prepare itself to become the primordial foundation for an entirely new reality. The infinite freezing vacuum will mathematically compress. The strict laws of conformal geometry will flawlessly execute the crossover. And from the absolute thermal exhaustion of our dying void, the superheated plasma of a brand new Big Bang will violently ignite. The infinite chain of existence remains strictly unbroken. The mathematical engine of reality requires no beginning, it demands no end, and it perfectly guarantees that from the absolute freezing depths of the final void, a new universe will always relentlessly emerge,